Well, Chris, thank you very much for joining us here on Stacking Victories, and looking forward to the conversation and learning more about your story and seeing how it can be helpful to the folks checking in and listening. So, again, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Chad. It feels like a real honor to be invited to do this. So thank you. And so, can I kick us off with a quick prayer?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Dear Father in heaven, Lord, thank you. Thank you for how you've walked me and my family through some really hard times. And you've shown us how much you love us, both in the big things and in the little things, the little victories that stack day by day. Lord, thank you for loving us all the way that you do. And I pray that my story is helpful to at least one person listening, that it's uplifting, that it's encouraging. And Lord, if there's anything I say that's not from you, Lord, just let it fall on the ground, break into a million pieces, and blow away with the wind. If it's something that's helpful to someone, that it's based upon your love and your truth, then may it explode in their hearts. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Well,
Let's roll, man.
let's do it. Yeah, so growing up, what was early life like for you? Where did you grow up? Sort of family dynamics, and
Okay.
kind of kick it off from there.
Okay. So start at the beginning. So I'm the youngest of four kids. Got grew up in a mid-Atlantic city, lower middle class family, ethnic family. So all my grandparents came to this country from overseas back around the early 1900s. And so both my parents were first generation in this country. So they're kind of like bridging the gap between those two, American culture and that culture, other culture. So that's one of the things that I grew up with, was not quite feeling like I'm like the other people in my neighborhood, because we had this, ethnic background. And so that was one thing where, uh, and that kind of set up a pattern in my life, because when I was at school, I was with my quote American friends, right? And then when I went home, and we, in our church and that type of stuff, then I had my ethnic friends, and rarely did those two worlds collide.
Hmm.
Okay, so I learned kind of early on how to compartmentalize my relationships in my life, and that was kind of a pattern that got set up. Okay, so that's one thing. Two, I'm blessed that my parents stayed together their entire marriage um, until my mom's death when she turned 65. Uh, and there was a lot of struggle in that marriage as well. Okay. It took a long time for me to realize how much my parents really loved me, because I was growing up, I could see the strife, and there was a lot of dysfunction in the family. There was a lot of love too. And it wasn't until I got into recovery that I saw how hard my parents really had worked, to protect us, to feed us, to get us an education. That was a very high value in our family, because at least in that generation, a college education was your ticket to a better life. That's changed nowadays, but back back in the day, that was a very important thing. It was our ticket out of a lot of financial hardship. So because of this emphasis, is like work hard, study hard, get good grades. So I started setting up this kind of like performance-based mentality. Okay. And, when I turned 16, I got a job, actually working for my dad. He ran a fast food joint um, uh, in the city. And so it was work, spend a lot of time studying during the week, you work the Saturday and the Sundays, that type of stuff. Didn't really get much of a break. Pretty stressful type of thing. Okay, so that's one theme that kind of then continues on into my the rest of my life. Let's see another thing. Okay, so I had a lot of speech problems growing up.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, I didn't really start talking verbally in a way people could understand me until I was like about 3 or 4 years old. Okay. And it wasn't for lack of intelligence. And it wasn't, I found out much later because our son ended up having the same type of issues, maybe not to the degree that I had, but um, enough where it was noticeable. And he went to a speech pathologist and he's told that he wasn't stuttering, that he was doing what's called cluttering. And I recognized, oh, I was doing the same thing. And what cluttering is I can get so many thoughts in my head, all trying to get out of my head all at the same time,
Okay.
that they clash right in the middle of my throat. So I would start talking, and then I'd lose a thought because they'd all collide and then break apart and fall to the ground. And then I was like, now, trying to figure out what was I about to say, which one of these things, and just kind of stop talking. And it turned out to be real irritating to a lot of other people, including my siblings, right? Teachers, that type of stuff. Come on, just spit it out. Come on, get it out, right? And so it took a long time for me to learn to just work through that and come up with tools where I wouldn't be cluttering. And you'll probably notice as this interview goes on, if you hear like an odd pause, like I'm in the middle of a sentence and I just stop for a second,
right,
what I'm doing is decluttering my thoughts before I say them.
Okay.
Okay. So
now, was that something that you learned through this process as a child?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the speech pathologist recommended. Just stop a second, think, and then continue. Okay. So there was a side benefit, though, of all of that experience is that it gave me a love for language because words were so difficult for me at the time, and you couple that with being surrounded, an ethnic family. And so, and being the youngest, everyone is talking and very loud and boisterous. And I couldn't get a word in sideways, with a hammer if I wanted to. So I learned how to listen, but not correctly. I was listening to find an opening in what people were saying so I could get my words out, right? Rather than actually listening to other people, what they were really trying to tell me. And it wasn't until I got into recovery that I learned how to listen. Because I'd be in a meeting and they say the way the meeting works is one person shares, and when they're done, all you say is, thank you for sharing, and shut up and wait for the next person, right? And that gave me the discipline to learn how to really hear people, not just hear the words, but actually understand what is this person's telling me, not only the meaning, but also the emotional impact. What are they really struggling with? What does it feel like for them? And and that's one of those things that I was taught in recovery, that when somebody gives a testimony, sort of like what we're doing right now, it's not only helpful for the person giving the testimony because they're getting the thoughts out, they're getting all these emotions out of their head and into the air, right? And getting relief from it. But also, as a listener, I'm getting healing from what they're telling me.
Right.
I see my story and their story. you know. And even though a lot of the details of their story might be different, it's like, I can relate to that. There have been times when I've heard people share and they saying something that to me it sounds like this is absolutely batshit crazy what this person's telling me, what they're thinking. And I've done the exact same thing. I've had those exact same thoughts. and it and that kind of deflates the ego,
Right.
but also helps me feel that I belong someplace. Because, getting back to this ethnic versus my American friends split and that type of stuff, I kind of felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I quite didn't feel like I belonged to my family because I was the youngest. I couldn't get my words out. Effectively, nobody had time for that. Just to wait around and hear me talk, right? So I didn't feel like I belonged there as well. Okay. So, it's been said that when people are in dysfunctional families, that early on they develop one of three strategies of who they're going to be. Are they going to be the good guy, the tough guy, or the party guy?
Okay.
Okay. And I've heard several counselors talk about that general strategies people develop when they're young and they're under stress, family dysfunction. And I tried to be the good guy. And so it's exhausting being a good guy. You know that?
Well, what's that look like? What is, I guess, the nature behind a good guy?
Okay. Part of it's emotional dishonesty, saying yes when I really want to say no.
Okay.
Right. And then carrying a resentment and not telling anyone about it. Okay. Being a good guy means I got to keep my problems all to myself. So if I can, if I'm feeling fearful about something, I don't have the right to share that with anyone else because it would be a burden on them. Right. So, and I want to be a good guy. I don't want to trouble people with my stuff. So that was one of those running themes throughout my life. And as when I did my 4-step inventory, that was like within the top 3 of the list of character defects was how emotionally dishonest I was with myself and with everyone else around me. And so that's exhausting. Said before about, I thought that with respect to academics, that if I could keep getting A's and that type of stuff, would feel better about myself. It turns out that, yeah, I was bagging A's and B pluses consistently throughout my entire, schooling and university experiences. But still, I felt like I was still a knucklehead. I wasn't good enough. People would say, wow, you got great grades. And I say, well, yeah, but they could be better. Right. Or, I never learned how to accept a compliment that was given in good faith. Just never knew how to do that. Right. Because I would judge myself harshly because I thought that if I was the highest performer, I thought if I was the smartest damn dude on the block, that I would feel better about myself and I could protect myself from all of the chaos that was going on in my life. So let's talk about some of that chaos for a second.
Okay.
As to why I fell into that. Okay. My mother suffered from panic disorder. But back in the day, back in the 50s and the 60s, nobody knew what panic disorders were, anxiety disorders. The psychological community was absolutely clueless about what this actually meant. Okay. Thank God there's a lot more good research that's been done and better treatment for panic disorders now. But at the time, she got misdiagnosed as having obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a real thing, but that's not what she had.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctors treatment for her in her OCD was to put her on benzos. And benzos, we find out later, the maximum prescribed dosage duration should be about no more than a month. She was on them for 10 years. And I didn't realize it, but my mom was a pill addict. And she was hooked. And with all the stuff that comes with a benzo addiction, it's really rough on people. It's, everyone understands what opioid addictions do and what cocaine does and crystal meth. There's not as much cultural knowledge about what a benzo addiction is like. And emotionally, she was a very fragile person. She could fall apart emotionally just like that. And it was, as a young kid, it was really hard to be around that. Okay. When I got home from school, I never knew what I was going to walk into when I got at home. When my mom was feeling good, oh, she was a wonderful person. Okay. Energetic, funny as hell, right? Real enthusiastic about things. I mean, she could really be full of life. And then be other times she'd be either really angry or she'd just be down in the dumps and couldn't get out of bed until 11:30 in the morning. Just so growing up, that was really confusing. And so I started walking on eggshells. I never knew what I would say that could trigger her to just fall apart, literally fall apart emotionally right in front of me. And so you couple that with words already being hard to bring out. And it's like, no, I got to be really careful about what I say. Right. And so there's a lot of anxiety because I felt like I was walking through a verbal minefield.
So just for my own clarity and understanding, so the ups and downs that you described for your mom, that is the panic disorder that she was dealing with, not necessarily a side effect of the benzo stuff.
Well, I think it's both.
It was coupled together.
Yeah, because this is what the research shows now, that somebody that's on benzos like Xanax, Valium, some of these other things, they're rapidly, you get your hit and then the body eliminates it pretty quickly. So a person can get high off of them in the morning and they're physically crashing in the afternoon, that their body's eliminated it. And so now they're going into withdrawal. Okay. With opioid addiction, it takes like a day or two for a person to get dope sick. Okay. But they get to be withdrawn off of benzos. It's within a 24-hour period, sometimes a 12-hour period. Okay. So someone who's using benzos, they're getting the effect and then crashing and then feeling awful. They got to take more. That's why it's just this rapid cycling of using it or getting really unstable, because anyone who's crashing off of a drug like that they're in trouble. Okay. Their body's screaming at them. Their mind is going haywire. And that's what I was dealing with as a kid. Right. So there was a lot of stress of all of this sort of stuff. And so I would just kind of take it in and try to convert that into, I'm going to be a good guy.
Okay.
Okay. There's another lesson I learned in all of that, and that was that I had a job, and my job was to manage the emotional state of my mom. Okay. And I translated that into, it was my job then as a husband, as a father, to manage the emotional state of the women in my life.
Okay.
Okay. And that comes into play later on in life, but it all got teed up that it was my job to try to manage my mom's emotional state, to try to keep her from crashing or raging out or something like that, to try to be kind of unobtrusive and self-sufficient, so I wasn't putting a burden on her. Again, that's that good guy mentality, right? I come to understand much later, once our whole family got thrown into recovery, that I picked up a particular role, and that's a role of they call it the lost child. And what a lost child is it's not the mascot, it's not the scapegoat, it's not the enabler in training or anything like that. A lost child is that typically it's the youngest of a large family, is like kind of ignored, kind of shrinks into himself or herself, and kind of gets ignored by everybody else, because everyone else either has a focus because they're mascot, or the focus because they're a scapegoat or something like that. It's a lost child that kind of stands in the corner and saying, there's something really screwed up here. I don't know what it is, but this is one messed up place. And that's where I was. And so it took a lot of hard work, a lot of meetings, and working with counselors, have a wonderful place in recovery. If you can find the right one, that is, who understands recovery and family dynamics, that is, because there's a lot that don't. Okay, but if you can find one, then, they're really helpful. Okay, they're lifesavers. I mean, literally, they can be lifesavers. So, so that's kind of, the earlier years. And
well, I wanted to jump in. So I'm interested. You mentioned the mascot, scapegoat, the enabler, that sort of stuff. You said you were the youngest of four.
Yeah.
And you identified your position, if you will, or your label. Did the other three sort of fill in the other ones, or were there multiples of a particular one?
Yeah. So my oldest brother was kind of picked up two roles. One, he was kind of the scapegoat. That poor guy, he got punished every day for something he done wrong.
I think that's sort of normal for the eldest child. The first one, the parents are trying to sort of figure things out.
I know they were definitely trying to figure things out. No doubt about that. Okay. So in one aspect he was, and the family roles can change over time and that type of stuff. He ended up picking up a good guy role. He ended up going into law enforcement. Okay. Because he had picked up that protector role, as well as being the oldest, and he was the strongest of the four of us. That was kind of his role, and he ended up doing that professionally, right? So then my sister is the next in line, and she's a beautiful girl, beautiful woman, and pretty kind person, funny as hell, and she was kind of the mascot, and it was our job as the brothers to protect your sister,
right?
Okay. And then the third was the middle brother, right? Even though when you have four, where's the middle, right? 2.5, right? Okay, but he was the second son, and I wouldn't say golden boy, because he actually did work hard and he earned everything that he got. But he was kind of like the athlete, and I think he was of the three brothers, he's probably the most handsome guy, right? And so, he had a lot of positive regard, and I'm very close, especially to the middle brother, really close. So that's kind of how the roles kind of panned out.
So talk about relationship with mom and how all of that went with her panic disorder. We just sort of covered the siblings and how that matched up there. So you talked about staying on the siblings for a moment, because I just had a thought. You talked about being the lost child,
right?
And yet you have a close relationship, at least with the middle one.
Yeah.
And I've heard you other times talk about the rest of your family, so I know that it's not necessarily distant, but
yeah.
Growing up, you sort of ignored by your other siblings and just left to sort of fend for yourself, or did they bring you along and
Well, um, my older brother and my sister, you know, 7 and 5 years ahead of me.
okay,
Okay. So
big
as
difference,
you know, when you're young, younger, the difference between, a 17-year-old doesn't want to hang out with a 10-year-old.
right?
Okay. Just plain and simple, right?
Yeah,
Okay. Um, and because, we had a relatively large family and, in a 4-bedroom house, well, do the math, right? My
hmm
parents get one room. The eldest gets one room. My sister gets her own room because she's the only girl, right? And so the middle brother and I, we got double celled. So that's one of the reasons why we got so close is
right.
because, we shared the same room for a long time. I remember being overjoyed once um, my sister was the first one out of the house. I was like, dang, I get my own room now. That was so unusual.
What age was that?
Oh, I was probably like around 15 years old.
Wow. Okay.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So, so, so with my oldest brother and my sister, it's a cordial relationship and that type of stuff. We just don't get much opportunity to get together. But when we do, we have a great time.
hmm
Okay. It's not like I don't harbor any resentment towards them or anything like that. Our lives have kind of gone in different directions. But still, we get together as families, like a couple times a years, you know, in a year, and we always have a good time. And every one of them can cook really good. Okay, so that makes it a fun
Yeah, I bet.
get together because we eat very well when we get together. So that's one thing, good thing that my mom taught us was how to cook. And just for you folks out there, if you're a single guy, if you learn how to cook, that really goes well with your first couple dates. Okay, keep that in mind.
I bet it does. Yes.
Okay, so one person I haven't spoken about is my dad.
Right.
Okay, I kind of figured that's where you were going. So great minds think alike. So the my dad, I think, was kind of a lost child in his family. So and also a good guy. So I didn't realize how much my dad had really sacrificed for the family until I got much older. And he actually stepped away from a lot of opportunities to be able to support my mom through her difficulties, and that type of stuff. He opted not to go after several promotions because that would have meant packing up and moving. He said, "There's no way this I can, you know, your mom isn't going to survive a move like that, right? It's going to be really bad." And he didn't want to do that to her. So he sacrificed a lot. Okay. And I came to understand that. And he also, in his job, he worked weekends. So we didn't have a lot of time together. And so, um, even though the relationship was cordial and whenever time we had time together was good, it just wasn't a whole lot of time. Just not a whole lot. And so it's kind of distant. And with my mom's personality and the issues she was dealing with, she was the type of person that could suck the oxygen out of the room,
Mm.
right? So all the focus was always on my mom. My dad was kind of in the background. And so once all, got into recovery, and we'll talk about that later as how that journey started. But I'd always had kind of like this positive regard for my dad, even though it was not there wasn't a whole lot of interaction there, but the interactions there were positive. I ended up working for my dad at his restaurant, and so I got to respect him. He's actually a great boss, and it wasn't just because I was the boss's son. I could see how he treated everyone, respectfully. But he's also an effective boss. He could spot the knuckleheads and the thieves, pretty quickly, and say he'd interview somebody walk in and after seeing him work for a day, he'd say, "Yeah, this one ain't going to last," or "This one's going to hang around," right? So he's a good boss and a good dad, and so I had this thing in my mind that my mom was kind of like the villain, and my dad was the good guy. And it wasn't until the recovery journey started that I understood two things. One was how much resentment I was actually carrying towards my dad because he didn't protect me from all this stuff.
Hmm.
He never really stood up and said, "This has got to change," right? And so I had to work through all that anger, and this was after he had passed away. Okay, so my dad wasn't even around by this time. But for like an entire weekend, I was just like seething, the steam coming out of my ears at all this anger, resentment that he didn't step up, right? And as I started working through these feelings, using the tools that I've been given, it's like, what was triggering all that anger, because anger is never a primary emotion. It's always a reaction to something else, right?
Right.
Okay. It's, people just don't go from being pleasant to angry. There's because fear, shame, frustration, loss, something like that. And I realized that I was so angry because I was feeling abandoned, that I was left to fend for myself with all of this craziness. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. I then eventually got to the point where nobody in my family, when I was growing up, had the benefit of 12-step recovery, had the benefit of good family counseling. We had none of that stuff. We were out there all by ourselves, twisting in the wind, okay, with all the addictions and pathologies and all this other stuff and the family dynamics, just twisting in the wind with no help, right? And sometimes I torture myself. It's like a 12-step fantasy that I have. I wonder what my family would have looked like if we had had the benefit of that type of recovery back then.
Yeah, the what ifs.
Yeah. And I learned in one program for codependency, it says that sanity starts when we stop trying to improve our past.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I can't improve my past. It's a question, can I learn from it? Can I accept it? Can I make sense of it and then use it to help other people as well as get my own healing? It's a piece of ancient wisdom that says, confess your sins to one another, your stuff to one another, and pray for each other that you may be healed. I came to understand the deeper meaning of that. It's not just I get healing because I say my stuff. I said, when I say my stuff, you get healing too.
Right.
Right. In the same way, when you share your stuff, I get healing too. So to use a Southern translation of that, confess your stuff to one another that y'all may be healed. So, okay. So,
All right. So the growing up or anything in life, it's not just doom and gloom or negative stuff. There's fun. There's hobbies. So growing up, what were the things that were of interest to you? What'd you get into? Where was fun in your life?
okay. So the fun things in my life, probably the biggest joy was my grandparents, my mom's parents, lived a couple miles from our house. And so um, they were constantly over with no warning either. That's kind of an ethnic thing, a cultural thing. You know, it took a while for my wife to get used to that because she didn't come from, the ethnic background. So my granddad in particular, he is a great guy, just a real friendly guy, and my grandmother, she was a hard worker and maybe not as friendly and outgoing, but she was loving in her way and that type of stuff. And so we spent a lot of time over there, coming to our house. Big family meals, the holidays, and sometimes just, a Saturday afternoon or something like that, going over there. I learned a lot from my grandfather. And he was a wise man. I remember one time when he was probably in his late 60s. So I was probably like around 18 years old at the time. So I asked him what what it was like back in the old country where he had come from. And I was thinking his response was gonna be, "Oh, it's a wonderful place. The women were beautiful. It's a great countryside. It was like living in the Garden of Eden, that type of stuff." That was the answer I was expecting. His response was, "It's a horrible place to live."
Hmm.
I was kind of shocked. He said, "Huh? What do you mean?" He said, "Because he grew up in the hills of this country. It's pretty poor." And he said, "We were dirt poor. We worked from sun up to sundown every day. We worked like dogs. And the worst thing was we never had a hope for a better life." He said, "I came to America and then I had a hope of a better life." He came to this country when he was about 18 years old, 19 years old. And by the time of 24, he had his own restaurant and he had his own house.
Hmm.
So when the Great Depression hit in 1929, the stock market crash, he never walked a bread line. He'd only been in this country for like about 10 years. By that time, he was married. My mom had been born shortly before, all the economic troubles, and then my aunt was born a couple of years later. They never had to take a handout from anyone because he had come to this country of opportunity, and he was just so thankful and so grateful. And that was a big lesson for me, to have this appreciation for what this country has and what can be lost if we're not careful. So, other things that I like to do, Little League Baseball and that type of stuff. Middle brother and I, we started baseball all the time, and, he's a little older, a little stronger. And so he was the pitcher and I was the catcher. And we were just talking yesterday on the phone because it was his birthday.
Yeah, okay.
And so we were kind of reminiscing about old times. He says, "Yeah, I remember how one time I threw a curveball and you didn't see it coming and it hit you right in the chest and flattened you, right?" I said, "Yeah, and I remember the time when after you got me into trouble and I got grounded, you didn't have anyone to play with, so you start taking a baseball and throwing it on the porch roof and just let the ball run down the roof and then you catch it, right? And he overthrew it and ended up breaking my sister's bedroom window."
Wow.
So we were talking about that. That happened like 60 years ago. We're still laughing about it, right? It's just that type of stuff. Some of those great memories, of good times. We had an above ground pool in the house, spent a lot of summers there playing with neighborhood kids, backyard football, backyard baseball, that type of stuff. Our our house had one of the larger backyards in the neighborhood, so it ended up becoming kind of like a collection spot for a lot of the neighborhood kids. You don't see that much nowadays, which is really unfortunate. I think culturally, but back in the uh, late 50s, 60s, early 70s, that was kind of the thing to do. And so just a lot of that type of stuff. I love science. So science experiments, my brother and I, we had got one of these Mr. Wizard chemistry sets. And man, the havoc we created with chemicals, with explosions and toxic smoke and other things like that. Some of those were legendary.
That is interesting that, and I'm not as old as you, but there's still those types of things where you purchase them and actually had real chemicals in there that if any of those were sort of mixed together, you could get some bad fumes or something like that.
Oh yeah,
But you're not getting that nowadays. It's just interesting how all that changed. Back then, it's like, yeah, here's some just chemicals that could probably burn you, but go ahead and play with them.
yeah, exactly. I remember one time, we had like a little alcohol burner set up, and
Yeah.
I was just going through and I was taking little pieces of chemical and just kind of sprinkling them in the flame, see what would happen. And it's really cool when you drop iron filings in there because it lights up like a sparkler, and that's really cool. And then I grabbed a little bit of sulfur and do that, and I was like, so just fun stuff. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's the type of stuff, hanging out with friends, playing Monopoly, or as I called it, monotony after a while.
Does kind of go on and on and on.
Yeah. So, but that's the general sense of things. So you're right. It wasn't a terrible childhood. I've heard some horrendous stories of people, what they go through as kids. And I'm impressed by the courage of people who have gone through really hard things, especially when they were young, going through really hard things, and just their courage of pressing on and just not giving up. Okay. And more and more people I meet, the more it just, again, it reinforces that belief that, you really don't know what somebody's story is until you ask and they tell you. I don't know what it is about me, Chad, but, there have been times I can strike up a conversation with someone, and within 10 minutes, they're telling me all sorts of shit about their life. And I think it's because most people never take the time to actually listen to somebody else,
Right.
and then ask simple questions, and to become a safe person so that someone can feel, safe enough to share something that's on their minds. So that's,
Well, I think a lot of that goes back to what you were saying earlier about how you learned with the the cluttering
Yeah.
issue that was going on, and you realize that at some point in your life that you listened to find the opening to be able to get your words out,
Yeah.
versus listening for the intent of hearing the other person and see what's
Yeah.
going on. So at least from my own experience, hanging out with you for 8-9 years now, and having lots of different conversations.
Yeah.
Very good listener, and you're easy to talk to, and so I think all of that comes from what you learned there as far as being able to listen to the other person rather
Yeah.
than just trying to find that opening. So
Yeah. I've come to understand the power that most people have never really been heard in their life. And that can be kind of like it's a simple act, but can be, I think, one of the greatest acts of service and love to another person is just to sit and actually hear their story. To hear them and to hear their heart. It's so rarely done. Our culture is just inundated with noise and with sound, and we don't know how to be quiet. We don't know how to be still. I'm talking to myself. Okay. Okay. It's not an accusation to everyone. Okay. But it's an observation I see that, our culture doesn't support having moments of peace and reflection. You know, I had a job years ago where it was a very long commute. It was over an hour in heavy traffic just to get to my job. And I used to have the radio on the whole time, listening to shock jocks or listening to headbanging rock and roll or whatever was on the radio, right? traffic and news. Just my day was constantly filled with sound. And once I got into recovery, I learned how to turn the radio off once in a while. You know, that I can just that I can drive, and I still have long commutes. Okay, in my job, but I can actually sit there while I'm driving and looking at the countryside as well as monitoring the traffic. I can start processing my day. Okay. I can start looking around and maybe having some gratitude for, a beautiful sunset, or, seeing some countryside. You know, I never had that before in my life. It's constantly filled with noise. So I think it's important, to listen to other people, because one of the biggest problems I had growing up, getting back to that, with the cluttering, that type of stuff, I never felt like I was heard. I just felt like I was constantly being shuffled off to the side. Nobody has time to listen to me, right? It's too painful for people to wait for me to get my thoughts out. And where it's like, oh, that's the youngest kid, who listens to him, right? At least I'm not sure that was the message that my siblings wanted to send. That was the message I received. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So I'm not putting it all on them. Part of it's just my stuff as well. But I never felt like I was heard for a long time. Of course, I didn't help that because I wouldn't share stuff because I was emotionally dishonest anyway. Right? How are people going to know what's going on in my head if I don't tell them?
Right. No mind readers. Yeah.
Yeah. So
what was church? Learning of God growing up.
okay.
Was that there?
Okay.
What was that dynamic with the family?
Oh, okay. So, coming from an ethnic background, it was Orthodox Church, Orthodox Christian Church, not Orthodox Jewish, Orthodox Christian Church. And so, and when I was really young, like I said, my dad worked weekends and that type of stuff. So we really didn't go much to church. So then, in our area, a new Orthodox church was being planted. And so by this time, I'm like around 12, 13 years old. Okay. And so our family wasn't part of the original plant, but within 2 or 3 weeks, we started attending. And it's like, and so I started going to church, and we started going in like early part of June. And I was shocked where that we kept on going during the summer months on Sundays. I thought churches took summer vacation just like schools
Right.
did, right? Because that's how infrequently we went when I was younger. Okay. But our family got heavily involved in this church. I got involved in the youth group, became an altar boy. Okay. So this is now this good guy mentality again. Be of service to everyone, right? Work hard and that type of stuff. And, my mom was an excellent singer, so she was in the choir. And so I ended up singing in the church choir as well. So, I had all these activities that I was involved with. And, I love singing in the choir. I love being part of the service. What I wasn't doing, though, was I wasn't really worshiping. I wasn't, I was so active participating in the service that I was missing the whole point of the service. So when I got into my college years, I was burnt out. And so I kind of like withdrew from all of these activities. I had aged out as an altar boy, aged out of the youth group. I'd been in the choir, and finally I said, I'm just going to stop. And I started going to the service just as a parishioner, right? So, to a certain extent, the Orthodox service is, it's got a lot of beauty and majesty and mystery. But I was at a point spiritually where it wasn't working for me because it was so based upon tradition. It was like, there's got to be more to it than just tradition, right? Where's the power? Where's the grace? It seems like I feel like I'm working real hard, but I'm not really getting anything. I'm not understanding, and that type of stuff. With decades of hindsight, what I realized was I completely missed the message of God's grace and of God's love. I was in that earning mentality. I got to earn my way into God's favor. And as it'll come out later on through this discussion we're having, that there were a lot of things that I had done to hurt a lot of other people, and to turn away from God. And God loved me so much that he sent his only son to pay the price for my sins. Not just the sins of the world. He did that, right? But for me, Chris, when Christ died on the cross, he had me in mind along with everybody else. Okay. He had me in mind. And because he's God, he has the mental capacity to do that. Okay. And even before I was born and born a sinner, he paid that price. And God gave me the grace to get a hold of that. But at that time, I really didn't understand that. And so after going a couple months without being so active in service, I felt like there's really nothing there for me. And so I stopped going to church. And I called myself an agnostic. Right? Because, the term atheist just sounds like too much in your face. Okay. But looking back, really what I was a functional atheist. Okay. I wouldn't use the words, but that's how I was functioning. I also found out later that, like I said, I got this love for words and language and
Right.
like derivations of words, the etymology, to use the technical term. And the word agnostic is a Greek word. It has an equivalent in Latin that's also used more commonly than agnostic. It's ignoramus.
Okay.
A person with no knowledge.
Right.
That's really what being agnostic saying. I don't know if there's a God or not, But functionally, I acted as if there was no God. I was the one in charge. I didn't want to be in charge, but I felt like I had to be in charge because there wasn't anybody in my life I could really rely on. Okay, that's all that family dynamic
Right.
of my dad withdrawing, not being heavily involved, and my mom being so emotionally unstable and that type of stuff, that I didn't have a picture of someone who was reliable that I could emotionally trust, with my life. And I just transferred that on to God, So, so I lived probably like about 8 years as a functional atheist. And those were lonely times. So, one thing I think I want to start getting into is, it was like around that 12-year-old period of my life, that I discovered pornography.
Okay.
Okay. And for me, pornography and masturbation, it was addictive from the very first exposure. I was off to the races. And I came to understand later, why did this take such a sudden and death-like grip on me? It is because while I was viewing that stuff, I wasn't thinking about my anxiety. I wasn't thinking about my anger. I wasn't thinking about any of that stuff because it consumed my entire mental and emotional bandwidth. And I just felt better for a while. But then I got caught in that trap, you know, because I also knew that what I was doing wasn't right. I know it wasn't right from the get-go because I was so secretive about it, right?
Right, exactly.
You know, if it's something that I was proud of and was okay, I'd be actually telling people about it, right? So, hey, listen, I found this brand new thing and it's really cool and you should try it too and all that sort of stuff. No, I wasn't doing that. I was
So
hiding it.
how did you come across the pornography?
Older sibling,
Okay,
you know, he had some material.
gotcha.
I found it.
Yep.
You know, it's, tale as old as time, right? You find somebody else's stuff and it's like, this is interesting. And so it just it kind of took over. Not kind of, it did. Okay. And, and then there were times I would try to swear off of this stuff, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't maintain it. And every time I went back, I felt like a real piece of crap. What's wrong with you, Chris? What, by this time there was some awakening of a relationship with God because we're now going to church. And I felt like a huge disappointment to God. I just felt awful and I couldn't stop. So when I got, and then I think that had an impact in my later teen years because being like nerd boy, at school, he's a science engineering type math guy, and got this stuff going on. I didn't have any girlfriends, right? For a long time, relationships with, female sex was strained, very frustrating. Okay. Felt like I was constantly ignored, or written off as a nerd. It didn't help that I went to an all-male high school.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So even through my college years and into my mid-20s, relationships were really difficult. They would go probably the longest run I had prior to meeting the woman who is now my wife. Probably I think it was like 6 months. But most of my dating relationships would wash out when I was after about 3 months. So also, this is before internet dating, like, the sites like Tinder and Christian Mingle and Match.com and all these other things. Back in the day, they would have these little ads in the back of local magazines in search of, right? Okay. So I went on a bunch of those when I was in my 20s and I met some interesting people, maybe not necessarily in a good way. Okay. But I met some people, some women, and I did learn a lot, but nothing really came of it, that type of stuff. And so because of that, my addiction took off, viewing pornography every day, masturbating every day. I couldn't go 24 hours clean and sober. I just couldn't do it. Right. And by that time, I got my degree with pretty good grades, right? Got a decent job in my field, in a technical field, and started rock and rolling with that. Eventually moved out from my parents' house, bought my own place. Um, First got an apartment, and then a year and a half later, I actually had owned my own home when I was 23 years old.
Okay.
Okay, so
Nice.
and been a homeowner ever since. So, um, so I spent those years in my 20s, again, this good guy mentality, working hard, trying to save my money, you know, being helpful with the family, and my friends. Spent a lot of time playing softball, and hanging out with friends and other things like that, and the family, and just feeling intensely lonely. Just, I remember one time I was just like laying in my bed, and I was just in tears. I was just so incredibly lonely, and with no one to talk to about it, and with no one to really share my life. And it was, some people look back at their youth and they have like, it's like this warm glow and all this other stuff,
Yeah.
And that type of stuff. And I look at it and I said, I basically survived it.
Hmm.
Okay. So, and yeah, there were some good things that happened, professionally and that type of stuff, but just emotionally and relationally, those were tough years. So it was around my 29th birthday that I ended up going, I was looking for things to do. Yeah, besides playing a lot of softball, I played a lot of basketball. Okay.
Makes
Who knew?
sense.
A guy like my height. Okay. But I got white boy's disease really bad, so I can't jump. But, I got all sorts of body mechanic issues that keeps me from being a great athlete or something like that. But, I like to play. My brother was a basketball player, and we play on the same team many times, and so that was a lot of fun. And then I'd had surgery, which where the doctor said you ain't playing basketball for a while. It was a sinus surgery. They straightened out some damaged cartilage in my nose. They said if you take an elbow to the face, it's going to be hell to pay. Repairing it the way it is right now. They said if you're gonna do something different, but you ain't playing basketball. Okay, well, you can try volleyball. I kind of like volleyball, right? It's you don't, the risk of getting hit in the face is not nearly as much as it in basketball. So I started playing. I found a group um, that had set up. I found this in the local newspaper. They said, "Hey, the local high school, every Wednesday nights, volleyball. All right, just show up." Cool. Okay, I go, and it was run by a group called the Tall Club.
The Tall Club.
The Tall Club.
Okay.
The Tall Club is for, yeah, it's like the name says, you got to be tall to join. If you're a guy, you got to be 6'4" or taller. If you're a woman, you got to be 5'10" or taller.
Okay.
Okay. So I started playing, with the Tall Club and having a lot of fun. It's actually a good group of people. And they said, "Oh, we're having a Valentine's Day party coming up soon. And it's going to be at this particular bar. They got a party room in the back, and that's where we're going to be, And I said, "Oh, okay. I think I'll join that." Right. So I go to my first social event of the Tall Club. And I'm talking with some of the volleyballers that I know and just talk with other people. And I see this beautiful woman come walking in the door. And it really ticks her off when I say this, but the way I describe it to other people, it's sort of like in the movies, when you see the one where all of a sudden the camera just focuses on that face and everything else is kind of grays and gets fuzzy and that type of stuff. You just focus
Right.
on her. And
A little bit of wind blowing the hair or something
yeah.
like that.
And but I actually experienced that. You know, I saw this woman walk in and she's, wow, I like her. Right. And so she comes walking by and she, I'm talking with some of the volleyballers, right? As she comes walking in, there's one guy says, "Oh, hi, Jill. How are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, crap. She's spoken for, right?"
Okay.
Right. Turns out she and some friends met this guy just the night before, just happened to cross paths with this guy. Uh, and they believed that this guy was like really irritating and that type of stuff. So they actually kept on bar hopping from one bar to the next to try to lose this guy.
Oh,
Right.
wow.
Right.
Okay.
So eventually she lost the guy. Right. And then she goes into this party and there he is. Right. And she's like, oh God, what do I do now? Right.
Bad penny.
Yeah. But that actually worked in my favor because she wanted to get away from this guy. So she started talking to me
Okay.
and we had a great conversation. And so um, I said, hey, you want to go out to dinner next Saturday? And she said, yeah, let me think about it. Okay. Give me a call. Right. So I said, okay. But what I ended up doing was by this time I had started my own business. I was a one-man operation. Okay. And I was tired of girls giving me their numbers and then I call them up and they act like, who the hell are you?
Mm.
Right. And just getting blown off. And I got tired of that. So I was like, okay, you want to date? Let's see if you got some skin in the game. Right. So I handed her my card. Right. And said, okay, if you want to go out, so you give me a call in a couple of days. Here's my card. It's got my number on it. Love to hear from you. And then we said goodbye and walked out, right? She said nobody had ever done that to her before, right? She
Okay.
said she was driving home and she put the dome light on in her car and she was looking at it. It's got my name on it. It says president
Okay.
of this operation. She's like, wow, I got a live one, right? Turns out I had the live one because it was a one-man operation. I was,
Right.
president, director of engineering, treasurer, and chief bottle washer and janitor,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is a one-man operation. So but she thought she had something really big, right? So we chuckle about that. So she, ended up going on the date. She eventually called me up. So she said it was one of the hardest things she ever did was to call a guy, uh, and we just had a wonderful time. And we were off to the races and we never went back to the talk club.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Never went back. And I proposed to her it was just over a year later. Okay. And we got married 6 months later. And that was 1988. And so we're coming up on 38 years of marriage.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. 2 years. We'll be
Congrat-
celebrating 40 years.
Congratulations.
Yeah. And I'm just so thankful because I see a lot of people whose marriages don't last that long. Okay. The only marriage amongst the four siblings, I got the second longest marriage. My sister married when she was 19 and she's older than me. So she's still married, and happily so. And, but
So, how old were you when you guys got married?
so I was 31 and Jill was just shy of her 30th birthday
Okay.
by a couple of months. And she said that was one of her life goals was to get married before she was 30. So I'm glad I could help her achieve a life goal.
There you go.
Right. And um, so we got married and, in hindsight, I thought, okay, this is going to fix all the problems that I had with pornography and masturbation because now I'm married, right?
Yeah.
You
Fixes
know,
everything.
now I got my woman, and there should be no need for that type of stuff. And I couldn't maintain it. Just could not do it. And the because marriage on the one hand, it's a wonderful relationship, but guess what? This is another human being, right? There's another person. She's got her own stuff, and that'll come out in this interview. And you know, I never got past at the time. It took a long time for me to eventually realize that I don't need to rescue her emotionally. That's not my job. Okay, my job is to love her and to protect her. Okay, that's my role as a husband, is to do those things and to sacrifice myself the same way that Christ sacrificed himself for the church. Okay, that's my job. That's my role. But my job is not to rescue her emotionally just to feel better about herself, because sometimes you just got to feel the things you got to feel, right?
Right.
And not interfere with her process of feeling her own feelings and dealing with them. I can support it. I'm not heartless. I'm not going to say, well, yeah, you go off in the corner, and when you're ready, come on back, and then we can continue. It's nothing of the sort. If she wants my input, she can ask, and if she does, I'd be more than happy to support it. She just wants to be quiet, doesn't want me to interfere at that moment. I can do that. I didn't know that at the time, right? So
what was the communication like in the first year or two of marriage? I mean, was it what you just described, or was it?
I guess communications, on the one hand, we could be deep about certain things, but because of my emotional dishonesty,
Right.
what I didn't share about my pornography usage or masturbation, right? I didn't share anything about my fears, or this generalized anxiety that I carried, right? There, I didn't share painful things from my past, right? I wouldn't share about how angry or frustrated I was, because I told myself I couldn't trust anybody else, including someone that important and that close to me as my wife, that I could not share that with her.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It was not my right to put that on her. So there's a lot of dishonesty. And so, coming from my part. And so, turns out that was kind of her background as well. Different story and that type of stuff. But she also was trying to manage my emotions. She thought that was her job as a wife. She grew up in an alcoholic home. And as she disclosed to me much, much later in life, she had been drinking alcoholically since a young teen. And I never knew that. I never clued into that. And so she, she had a lot of hiding about that. Okay.
Right.
So despite, in the face of us loving each other very deeply, there was still a lot of stuff between us. This addictions, my addictions and her addictions, still kind of standing in between our relationships with each other. So, which I look back with a good bit of sadness at the opportunities lost. Okay, and the pain that it caused, and we still stuck with each other, and so it wasn't knockdown, drag out type of fights and lots of verbal abuse or something like that. And yet there was this stuff in between us. So we were both working pretty hard, and trying to be good parents. Eventually after we were married like 5 years, we had our daughter, and then 5 years later, then our son was born. Okay. And so we were a looking good family. Okay. we, my wife had her career, I had my career, in the tech field. Um, had a nice house in the suburbs. We didn't have the white picket fence around it, but that was against the HOA code, right? We couldn't do that, right? 2 kids, had a dog, you know, intact marriage. People thought, hey, these people got it together, you know, they're a solid family and that type of stuff. And they couldn't see the toxicity that it slowly was building in the family. So I came to understand much later that one of the things both my wife and I were struggling with was actually called codependency. Okay. And these are coping mechanisms that develop when you are dealing with other people's addictions or other severe dysfunction. Okay. Like abuse or other things like that. And so, my wife and I were highly codependent people, and we're absolutely clueless about it. And so that reflected in our emotional dishonesty and not communicating at deep levels and having this real focus on doing rather than being and that type of stuff. And that's the environment that our kids grew up in. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so our daughter, well, let me back up a second. This is what the research shows about the causes of addiction. Okay. Any addiction. Doesn't have to be alcohol. It can be sex addiction. It can be food addiction. It can be gambling. It can be work, what have you. Okay. But that there's 3 risk factors, as they call it.
Okay.
First one is the genetics, right? If you look at the family tree, you start shaking it, how many nuts fall out, right? Right. Parents, grandparents, uncles, cousins, siblings, what addictions are there, if any? So that's the first one, the genetics. The second one is, what is the family attitudes towards addictions? Some families, everybody drinks, right? Good things happen, pop open a beer. Bad things happen, pop open a beer, right? Okay. Now that wasn't our family, mm-hmm. Okay, specifically, but so that wasn't as much of a risk factor, our family, other than, mom used pills. But none of us understood that as an addiction. Okay. And then the third one is what they call ACEs, adverse childhood events. Okay. And the stress of growing up in my family was as a collection of what they call little T traumas. The big T traumas would be like death in the family, job loss, violence, those type of things. But the little T traumas are the constant drip, drip, drip of stress, of being belittled, for example, or being bullied constantly, or what have you, or something like that. So I had a whole bunch of little T traumas. My wife had a couple big T traumas as well as little T traumas in her life. So that's where a lot of our codependency comes, and also her addictions, her drinking and my use of pornography and masturbation. And so our daughter inherited the genetics for it. And
well, before we get to the part where your daughter and son come into play with this, I'm curious. So when you had said at a certain point, probably towards the end of teenage years, before or about college or whatever, is kind of when you walked away from church.
Yeah.
You sort of aged out and aged yourself out of going to church. And so had church come back at this point?
Oh, okay. Like I said, met my wife, the woman who eventually became my wife, and proposed marriage to her, and she graciously accepted immediately, with big hugs and kisses and all that sort of stuff. And it was a very beautiful thing for me. So she was attending a Lutheran church at the time in the city. And so she said, well, I wasn't going to force her to marry in the Orthodox church, because she would have to convert. And I was like, well, there's nothing there for me anymore, right? So so I said, okay, let's get married in a Lutheran church. I start attending the services, and I kind of liking them, and so we ended up, getting married in this church, and it was a beautiful ceremony and really significant. We had a great time, and then after a while, by that time we had moved to a different location, and it was getting difficult to get down to to this downtown church. And so we started going to a different Lutheran church in the suburbs. And that's where my faith really took a huge positive turn. Pastor there was a great guy. The guy could actually preach. I found out later that at least in the Lutheran church, that at the seminaries, they really don't teach the Bible to their seminarians. Shocked the daylights out of me.
Yeah.
Really? He said, yeah, they don't teach that. He said, I had to learn this on, by taking different studies and that type of stuff. He said, I didn't learn any of this stuff in seminary. And so he actually preached from the Bible. And I was liking the messages. And then there was one time he's preaching on, it's out of the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10. And that is that the deceiver comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But that's Jesus is talking, he says, but I have come that you may have life, and you may have it abundantly. And that was one of those things, Chad, where it kind of lit me up. Like a 4th of July sparkler or a floodlight. It just lit me up and put me on fire spiritually. Because up until that point, I kind of understood the grace of God. It's like, okay, yeah, it's like a divine insurance policy, as Dallas Willard would say, right?
Right.
It pays off when you die,
Yeah.
right? Okay. It's much more than that, okay? That I can have an abundant life right here, right now. Okay, I don't have to wait until I die to experience the grace of God. And that was a gift from the Holy Spirit. It really was. Because up until that time, I was incapable of having that thought or even accepting that thought. Okay. And I was like, wow, that was one of those things I can point back to and saying, that was a huge turning point. Okay. It was like that my life does not have to be constant struggle, constant work, constant anxiety, constant shame, constant rage. It doesn't have to be like that. That I can actually experience joy in my life, and it's okay. I don't have to feel guilty about it. It's a gift from God, right? So, so that was one thing. So we start going to Lutheran church, and then eventually, we moved again to farther out in the suburbs, and it became really difficult to get to that church, right? So we started going to a non-denominational church. And there was a guy that I worked with who went to that church. And I found out that this guy, his name was Butch. This guy, he was a real follower of Christ. He was also a pretty good engineer too. Okay. But this guy was a real good follower of Christ. And by that time in my life, my parents' marriage was really, really struggling. Okay. And both my parents, by that time, they had had their own awakening of faith. And and even in the face of that, they were still at odds with each other because they never had the benefit of 12-step recovery or really good family counseling to work through these issues, right? And so I started having conversations with Butch, right? And there was one time where we were talking about at my parents' church. This is a Pentecostal church where, nothing against Pentecostals or something like that. But there's a lot of things I didn't understand about them at the time. And they talk about the speaking in tongues, and I went to a couple of their, my parents' church services, and it's like, something's not making sense here. I don't understand what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This seems really spooky and kind of strange and that type of stuff. So I'm sharing this with Butch, and he did something that shocked the daylights out of me. This is during lunchtime. We're in his office, and so he opens up his desk. He pulls out a Bible, right?
Okay.
And he starts flipping through, and he gets to a part in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, I think is like chapter 14 or 15, where he talks about speaking in tongues in church. And he starts reading. He says, okay, it's okay to speak in, if you have people speaking in tongues in church, but make sure you have a translator there, someone that has that gift of translating, speaking when people are speaking in tongues for the benefit of everyone that's listening. Because if you don't, then the strangers are come walking into your church and think that you all have lost your minds.
Right.
Right. And that's exactly what I was thinking, that these people had lost their minds because no one was translating. Right. And what shocked me was that was the first time in my life that someone showed me that I could find an answer to something, an issue or a problem in my life in this moment, that I could find an answer in the Bible. I never knew that. I just flat out never knew that. And Butch, thank God, showed me that the Bible can be a reliable source of how to live this life and to have an abundant life now as well as in the next. So it's just, those are little snippets of the journey there. And it's just, as the years went on, just learning to trust more and more. You know how in the AA story, they talk about, there's the 12 steps. Sometimes it's written, it says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. And then other renderings are having had a spiritual experience
Right. Yeah.
as a result of these steps. That's a reflection that, Bill W. and Dr. Bob had two very different spiritual experiences. Bill W.'s was like a very spectacular, instantaneous thing, right? And Dr. Bob's was, as he described it, was a slow progression of the more educational variety,
Okay.
right?
Right.
That was the words in the big book. And that had been my experience. And over the years, it was this slow unfolding of not only understanding, but more importantly, of trust. And so by the time we discovered our daughter's addiction, I needed every single ounce of that trust, because now we were face to face with a deadly disease that our daughter was struggling with. She was 17 years old when we discovered that she had been using heroin for by that time, about 6 months. But she had been dabbling in drugs. It turns out later, about 2 years. So she started, with pot, some alcohol. Alcohol was not really her thing. Even though she would drink, that was just not her thing. Pills occasionally. But when she got to, oxys, it was off to the races. And, the way when we first discovered this, the way she described it, I'm thinking to myself, this seems oddly familiar.
Right.
I can kind of relate, even though I did not understand what I was dealing with at the time as an addiction. But I was like, I think I know what she's going through because I've gone through the same type of thought process. So her discovery of her addiction, it was a discovery. It was not a disclosure. It was, I won't get into all the details of that.
Right.
But suffice to say, it came out in a very spectacular way. And by that time in our lives, my wife had become a nurse and had worked in the school systems. And so she was already familiar with troubled teens with addictions and treatment options and that type of stuff. Thank God she had the presence of mind to say, we got to address this right away. We cannot sit on this thing. We got to move fast. It's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. It's going to cost a lot of money. And it's going to be absolutely necessary. And it was exactly every one of those things. Okay. It was difficult. It was a lengthy process. It was expensive. It was gut wrenching and was absolutely necessary. And our daughter is still alive and she is doing great after 17 or 16 years of continuous clean time.
Praise God.
Okay.
That's awesome.
Praise God. Okay. But it was that first year and a half of this after discovery was really, really hard.
I bet.
Okay.
But it's interesting, just sort of interject here, as it relates to, again, stacking victories. Just, I'm sitting here and I've just got these little, droplets happening in my mind of, where God was showing up in your story, and just, I guess the places where God was showing up and being victorious in your life on your behalf, maybe without you even really aware at the time. Hindsight always gives us that ability to have that perspective. And so as it pertains to the faith journey, can see growing up in the Orthodox Church, establishing some level of a foundation,
Right.
and even if you didn't fully understand His grace and dying for your sins. And then you had the pause, and then you get to that point where you're back in church and you hear the pastor talking about living life to its full and having it abundantly. I think it allows that victory there for the next one, for you to be able to hear your friend Butch read to you about about speaking in tongues, but not so much about that, but more about being able to find an answer in the book,
Exactly.
In the Bible, that it's living and breathing and addresses, all of our issues, in the current. And so, and then double that into, your walk with your marriage, and that happened to come along at the same time of going back to church, and establishing the marriage, at least on a biblical foundation, even if it wasn't fully known at that point in time, and to the point where you're growing in your marriage, and you being somebody who has a way of an intellectual mind, and being able to look at things from that perspective, coupled into your wife and her profession, as you said, as a nurse, happened to be working at school at that time, and realizing the connection with the kids. So I see the victory, in that. All of these things preparing you to that point where it's discovered, as you just talked about with your daughter's, opioid addiction.
Yeah.
And it's not lost to me that all of those things that I just mentioned, there's others I'm sure that I'm just not thinking of at the moment, prepared you for this moment. And I mean, God knows everything that has happened, is going to happen, and is happening, and ways to you allow us to work with Him, and being able to better ourselves and other people. And so all of that leads up to that point where you're talking about that struggle, that extreme difficulty for that year and a half, the first year and a half of her recovery story. And so I just wanted to, I guess, for really my own benefit, maybe for anybody else that's listening, but just that's that process I do in my mind of like, okay, where was God actually showing up through these processes?
And here's one example of how the previous victories, once the stack gets a certain height or something like that, it means you can reach even higher, right?
Right.
Okay, you got something to stand on, right? Okay, so we, like I said, we discovered our daughter's addiction, and within 18 hours, we had her in a treatment facility. That was like about a 3 hours flight, 4 hour flight away from our house. We had her drug tested it, and we got the results like around 8 in the evening. By 10 in the evening, my wife had found a treatment center that had a bed open. And he said, when do you want us there? And he says, as fast as you can get here, right? So we got home, and that was a hellish thing because our daughter's now in withdrawal and getting very angry. And I'm on the internet making flight arrangements for two round trip tickets and one way ticket at 11:30 at night, with a departure at 6 in the morning that same day. Those are very expensive tickets.
I bet.
Real expensive tickets, right? And that was a night from hell. We get her down there to the treatment facility, drop her off, come home. Just my wife and I left her there. She was not happy to be there, and she let us know it. And then we came home, and we had to tell our son, because by this time, our son at the time, he was like 11, 12 years old, and this is happening with his sister. And when we were going through all that night from hell, we arranged for him to stay over he was at a friend's birthday party, and his friend's parents, good friends of ours, they invited him to stay overnight because we told him what was happening. He said, okay, we got him covered, right? We're not going to take an 11-year-old kid on a flight like that. So we get back. We then have to tell him. He was really upset because he said that he had been trying to tell us that there were bad things happening with her, and we would not listen. And he was just so angry at us, and rightly so. Okay. So the next several days were spent talking with counselors, telling our family members what's going on, talking with her high school, right? The job that she had, saying that she's not coming back. She had just started a job at a restaurant, and this is going to be her second day on the job when we discovered this type of stuff. And I had to call her supervisor and saying she ain't coming back. Sorry, medical emergency, right? So the next 2 days were just spent making all these phone calls, making all these arrangements, and that type of stuff, right? Finally, we get to that day where our son gets on a school bus. He heads off to school. My wife jumps in her car. She goes off, to run errands and that type of stuff. And I am left alone. And that is the first time since all this went down that I had a moment to myself, because everything else was just just focusing on getting her down there, getting my wife back, handling all these details. Now that was the time to fall apart.
Mm.
And that's exactly what happened. I fell apart within, when I realized that car was around the corner and she wasn't going to turn around and come back home like, oh, I forgot my purse or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I knew she was gone. And within seconds of that realization, I was face down on the floor. I am screaming. I am pounding the carpet with my fists. I'm so angry because I was so terrified at what all this meant. What was, her life was in mortal danger. Okay, people die from this stuff.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, and I knew that. Right, and there was no guarantees that she was going to get better. And man, I was scared. I was angry. I was a wreck. And I remember saying, God, I know you are here. Okay, please help me. That was also a turning point for me too, because, well, I'm sorry, 2 weeks later was another turning point as well, because the stress of all this sort of stuff really kicked up my sexual acting out with pornography. And I was just feeling terrible about it. And it was like a week or two later, I was back on the floor, and I was just terrified that I was going to die in this addiction, that I was going to go to my grave acting like this. And that thought just terrified me. And I don't want to do this anymore. That was the last time I ever sexually acted out.
Okay.
Okay. And it came to, so that was a victory right there, as well as, the fact that I could be yelling and screaming at God, and the whole situation with our daughter's addiction, and that discovery was stacked on the victory of trusting God in the first place.
Right.
And trusting in his character, that God wants me to be honest instead of being this emotionally dishonest guy, which is that theme that's been throughout my entire life,
Mm-hmm.
that I could actually be emotionally honest with the God of the universe. And it was okay. He wasn't going to throw a thunderbolt at me, and blow me off the face of the planet, that he was like, okay, now that we're being honest with each other, now we can talk.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I finally got honest with God. So that's a victory in and of itself, because I stopped hiding this stuff.
That's huge.
Yeah. It's like, come on, Chris. If God can create this entire universe in all of its breadth and all of its complexity, just like that, just by saying the words, ex nihilo, out of nothing, all this comes, right? Then I think he knows everything about me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Even more about me than I know about me.
Right.
Okay. So, and I learned to trust that was okay. There's a lot of people that, people who fall into this nihilistic mindset, that if God knows something about you, that means he's got power over you, and that's wrong. Because he's going to use it to hurt you or something like that. I learned that I can trust God, and that trust has been well-founded over the years. So that's a victory. The victory that I could be honest with God about my addiction, and he started revealing to me what this was all about, was huge. Okay, so let's go to the next stacking the victory. Okay, the next God shot and this whole progression of God shot of bombardment. So our daughter got out of this 28-day facility, and it was that was just the start. That just got her detoxed and that type of stuff. But she wasn't ready to give it up yet, right? But she was starting to learn how to say the right things. But it was like, well, you're still under 18, and we got a legal responsibility and the legal right to um, guide your care. So we pick her up from that place and transport her to the next place. It was New Year's Day. We were dropping her off. It was late in the evening because we had a long flight to get her from there to here. And so we start that process. And this particular place had a pretty good family program as well. Because, who knew addiction is a family disease? Everyone gets affected in one way, shape, or form. So I didn't understand that yet. It's kind of this thing, well, it's her addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's that have to do with me? So we get into the family program. We're there one weekend, and the instructor is talking about relapse and relapse prevention, because who knew opioid addiction is a relapsing condition. Relapse is very common, right? So instead of not saying anything about it, they say, okay, it's not a prophecy that your kid will relapse, but the probability is relatively high.
Mm-hmm.
So you probably want to recognize what are the things that you can help, delay that or prevent it, and what are the signs of it actually happening. So the instructor says, okay, this is what it's like for, a drug addict when they that starts a relapse. The relapse never starts the day that, at the moment that they pick up. It actually started a couple days to a couple weeks earlier than that. It's called a dry relapse. Okay. And it starts when something triggers a thought. It could be a person, a situation, an ad on a radio, right, or TV, something that somebody says. A daughter told us later that one of her triggers in the early going, she said whenever she would go to a restaurant, had utensils set out, the first thing she would do is, if there was a spoon there, say a teaspoon, the first thing she would do is she'd take that spoon and turn it over. Said, what's that about? She said, because that's how she used to cook her heroin, with a spoon, right? And so the fact that the spoon was, with the bowl facing upwards, that reminded her of cooking her heroin before she would shoot it. Mm-hmm. And so, it's that type of stuff. Yeah. Everyone's got triggers. I got my own triggers. I know what, I've learned what they are, and to either avoid them or how to deal with them when it happens. But either way, without the benefit of recovery, a trigger starts a battle in the mind. It's like, because the trigger, the reason why it's so sticky is because there's a little bit of release of endorphins in the brain by that trigger. And my brain says, oh, that felt nice. Please, sir, may I have another? Mm-hmm. Right? And so, but I also know that this is a bad thing. So now the battle's on. Okay. It's like, I like this. I want to think about this and that type of stuff. On the other hand, I'm trying to push it away. I don't want this in my life. I don't want this, be thinking about this. And what am I doing when I'm saying, I don't want to think about this? You know the answer to that, right?
You're thinking about it.
Yeah. Okay. So that doesn't work, right? So but there's this battle going on. And then eventually, I get exhausted with the battle, and just, they say the addict picks up and uses. And then it's clueless. Why did I just pick up? Why now? Right? And so 3 thoughts hit me. And this is 3 God shots within 5 seconds. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the first God shot was, as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking to myself, how did this lady crawl inside of my head and tell me how I think? Right? That was God shot number one. Number two was, pardon the language, holy shit, I'm an addict just like my daughter.
Right.
It's just a different drug of choice. And God shot number three, and this was not just like a 22 caliber round. This was like a hand grenade type of shot, and this was, and there's hope for a person like me.
Amen.
That was the big God shot, because by that time, my wife and I, we had started going to 12-step meetings, okay, for family members,
Mm-hmm.
the codependents, right? We knew what we had started getting them exposed to what the 12 steps of recovery were all about, right? More importantly, we heard the stories of other people, of God working in other people's lives, getting recovery, either from the effects of their loved ones' addictions, or their loved ones themselves are telling their stories, and we're hearing them by going to open AA meetings, right? And hearing these tremendous stories of recovery from really hard situations, right? So I knew that this recovery process worked because I'd seen it work in other people's lives. And God connected me to that process by that realization. It says, there's hope for someone like me. And that is the date that I really declare as my sober date, which is mid-February of 2009. That's when I finally made that connection that I was an addict. I needed help. I was powerless over this, and that there was help. And my job was to accept it and then roll with it. I didn't realize it, but I had actually did the first 3 steps of recovery just like that. It was like I was powerless over my addiction. My life had become unmanageable. Step 1, step 2, that there was a power greater than me. Thank God there's a power greater than me,
Mm-hmm.
Who could restore me to sanity. And that actually was his desire to do so. That's that John 10:10 thing. It's
Right.
actually God's desire for me to have an abundant life now. I didn't have to wait till later, right? And so the next step was, to turn my will and my life over to the care of God, however I understood him at the time. I didn't have to have perfect understanding, but, even that faith as small as a mustard seed was enough to get started. And so that's so okay, so here's the next God shot. Okay. So I'm having these realizations, and the next day I'm gonna wake up, as I started learning in my recovery to recite the first 3 steps.
Mm-hmm.
Originally it was around my daughter's recovery, and now it was, oh, this is also for me, right?
The daily renewal.
Yeah. And so exactly. But I didn't feel comfortable sharing that with my wife. How do you share something like that to the woman you love,
Yeah.
right? And say, oh, I've been watching pornography and I've been masturbating to the images of other women.
How long have you guys been married up to this point?
Oh, by that point we had been married. Let's see, that was like 21 years.
Okay.
Okay. And so, but I hadn't heard of, I didn't even know yet that there's a 12-step program for sex addiction. Okay. Totally clueless. Just didn't know that. But I started applying the 12 steps I'd learned in codependent recovery to that aspect of my life. And so I was starting to get some victory over this, right? Get relief from the compulsion of this. So by that, fast forward like 2.5 months. And so now I got in a job with another company, because that when this was all going down with our daughter and that type of stuff, I was unemployed.
Oh.
I had started my own business and the business failed, right? And so I was trying to get a job, and while I'm dealing with all this stuff, right? Okay. So here's another God shot. Okay. Like I said, business, I had no money coming in. There's all this money going out because rehab is really expensive. And this was before the healthcare law changed that required the insurance companies treat addiction and mental health services at the same level as any other physical illness.
Okay.
Okay. But they hadn't done that yet. And so that first year, we had just shy of $100,000 of unreimbursed medical expenses.
Wow.
Wow is right. It almost bankrupted us. Okay. That was a huge financial hit. And it's taken like 15 years, 18 years to recover just from that hit alone. Okay. And God's been faithful in that. And it's no longer a struggle. Finance is no longer a struggle. But it was really hard for a while. That my wife said, this is going to be expensive, right? She was right about that too.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a job. There's all this money going out the window and going through all these gut wrenching changes already emotionally and stuff. So I was just really struggling with all this panic about what am I going to do about this problem? Right.
Right.
And there's all this it's always on my shoulders. Again, that's part of how I roll that. I had this overdeveloped sense of responsibility. Remember, I'm the good guy,
Yep.
right? I don't have the right to put this stuff on other people. I have to handle my own stuff, and without any option of reaching out for help. So it's all this. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Well, guess what? I ain't falling asleep at night. I'm falling asleep exhausted, like around 2 o'clock in the morning because I cannot shut my brain off, and I'm waking up at 4:30 in the morning because I can't maintain any sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going on for like about a month, and I am going absolutely batshit crazy with worry and fear. And then one morning, I woke up. It was like around 7:30 in the morning. The sun was up, and I felt rested. And I was in that transition from sleep to being wide awake.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that's an interesting, physiologically, that's a very interesting state for the brain to be in because the limbic system is still working because that's what's operating when you're asleep, when you're dreaming,
Mm-hmm.
and that type of stuff. But the cognitive part of the brain is starting to awake. And there's that short period of time where the two are actually intimately connected, right? And I had this realization, and this is another one of those God hand grenades, right? Not just a God shot. It's like, God, I don't know how all of this is going to play out, but I cannot wait to see what it's going to be like because I know it's going to be good.
Hmm.
That was a thought I was totally incapable of having. But God used that moment of connection, intimate connection within my brain, which for the most part has been at war with each other for most of my life, was able to, use that connected point to reveal to me a basic truth that I was able to trust him in it. And not only was it going to work, but it's actually be pretty good. And that was a prophecy because it has come true in my life. Okay. That some really good things started to happen right away. From that point on, it was within a 1 month period that I had a job offer in hand.
Okay.
We had a place for our daughter to go on her next step of the journey.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so we dropped her off at this third place now, which was more of a longer term type of thing. Dropped her off. The next day I start a job, right?
Okay.
Okay, so now we got some money coming in. Okay, it's not enough to cover everything, but it's a damn sight better than nothing, right?
Right.
So now I got a job, in a technical field, and and she's got a safe place, it's part of her journey, right? And then, now, mind you, this is what I'm about to say. This is all happening when the real estate market and the stock market in general just was crashing and burning in 2009.
Right.
Okay. I mean, just really bad things were happening. Our neighbors, we saw, so let me back up. So I start this new job, and within a month, I was sent overseas to help negotiate a contract. Okay. It was like literally halfway around the world. Okay. And two amazing things happened. The first one was my wife says, "Hey, our neighbor's house sold." I said, "What? I didn't even see a sign." She says, "Yeah, it sold before they could get the sign up." I said, "What are you talking about? The market's is gone haywire." She said, "Not in our neighborhood." And she said, "Well," I said, "How much they get for their house? Do you know?" And she said, "Yeah." And she told me the number, and I was like, "Holy crap. That's a great number, right? Maybe we should put our house on the market." And Jill said, "I was thinking the same thing." So when I got back into town, we started talking about that and said, "Yeah, let's do this." Because by that time, the job that I'd taken was actually a good bit away. It was like an hour's drive, like an hour quarter drive. And I was like, this is an opportunity to move out of state and get to cheaper real estate market as well. So yeah, let's do this, right? We sold our house or put it out on the market. We listed it for $10,000 more than the neighbors did, and their house was pretty much similar to ours. Okay. Within 3 days, we had a full price, non-contingent offer on that house.
That's fast.
Yeah. I mean, it was just like blazing fast. Okay. So we got the house on the market, and we eventually sold, and we were able to buy a larger, newer house in the next state over. And we, for about 60% of the price, killed a lot of debt, had a much smaller mortgage payment. And then, so that started taking a lot of the financial stress off. So God was orchestrating all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the other really interesting thing that happened while I was overseas. Same trip. Okay. It's amazing what can happen when God takes me out of the picture, right? So so I'm talking to my wife, with the time difference, whenever it's morning where I was, it was evening where she was, vice versa, right? And so just the time I got called away, which was relatively short notice, we were both going to go to a weekend-long family therapy group experience for families struggling with addiction. And I couldn't go. Crap. I really wanted to go. So so on that Monday following, I called my bride and says, "So how was the weekend?" Right? And she starts telling me, how significant it was for her. And she said, "Oh, I got to tell you something." "Okay, what's that?" She says, "I'm an alcoholic." I was like, and it didn't shock me, but it also shocked me at the same time for different reasons. It didn't shock me because I knew what she'd grown up with in her family. Okay. Her daddy was an alcoholic. Grandfather was an alcoholic. Brother was a recovering alcoholic. Okay. So so that part didn't shock me. I was like, okay, yeah, she's got the family genetics, right? and I never saw it. I just never recognized it. Now I couldn't recognize the signs, but at the time I just never recognized it. So that's what shocked me. It's like, how can you be married, 21 years and not see it? Well, guess what? I found a way,
Sure.
right? And so she, there was another thing that was in the back of my mind as she's sharing this, right? So now she tells me that she's an alcoholic, and I know I'm a sex addict, and I haven't shared it with her.
Mm.
How am I going to do this, right? Because now I'm feeling really convicted, okay? So, she shares something really deep, and I'm still going to keep this secret. Well, God finds a way. So I finally get back into town, and it's a Friday evening, and we're on our, back porch having a nice dinner. It's just, my bride and I, and beautiful late spring evening. We're just out there having a nice meal, and she starts telling me more and more about, her weekend and her realizations and that type of stuff. And she said, there were a lot of guys there that were dealing with this thing called sex addiction. They talk about pornography, or one guy was into voyeurism, another guy who was exposing himself publicly and other things like that. But there's so many guys that talked about a problem with pornography. She says, Chris, have you ever had a problem with pornography? And it was just a really innocent question.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like she was fishing for something or something like that. I've known, by this time, I've known her for over 2 decades. I know when she's fishing and when she's just curious, right?
Right.
And that was a curiosity question. Chris, have you ever had a struggle? Because she heard so many guys struggling with this. You know that deer in the headlights look? I was like, oh no, right? And God was talking to me very clearly in my spirit and in my heart at that time. And that was, whatever you do, don't effing lie to her. Do not lie to your wife. I was like, okay. I had already trusted, stacking the victories again. I already trusted them with our daughter's addiction and recovery and that type of stuff. Stack another victory now. And that is, am I going to trust God with this?
Mm-hmm.
Deep breath. I said, yes, I have a struggle with pornography. And was starting in February, I realized that this was an addiction. And I started working the 12 steps around it. And instead of screaming at me or how could you do this or anything like that, she heard it, she accepted it, and she still said, I love you.
Wow.
Wow is right. That's not the typical reaction. So for all you kids back home, do not do this without help. Or this was one of those unique situations that God orchestrated in my life and in her life, create a situation where I could feel safe enough to tell her, and she felt confident enough to hear it without personalizing it. She had just shared her stuff, and I understood that her drinking was not something that I caused, right? And she translated that into that she was not the cause nor the object of my pornography usage. She was caught in the crossfire.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's not like she was happy to hear that I had been using pornography. It wasn't something that's like, yes. But she was like, she knew it was about me and my pain and not about her. Okay. What a huge gift. What an absolutely huge gift. Something that I had been hiding for decades from her, literally decades, and from other people. God had created a situation where I could share something like that and not get thrown out of the house. Because I know a lot of people that have been thrown out of the house because of their pornography usage. And God showed me a tremendous amount of grace in my particular case. Why, I don't know, right? That is not for anything I did. And I guess that's what grace is all about.
Mm-hmm.
It is unmerited favor. God did me a huge solid by allowing this, to play out the way that it did. I'm just so thankful. Okay, and it's actually pretty unusual. Most marriages, relationships where pornography is a huge issue. Most of them are discoveries, not disclosures.
Right.
Okay, and that's really traumatic, to the spouse. It's that's a deep form of betrayal, and I had betrayed my wife because I'd been putting my focus on other women and not her. And she understood that the betrayal was not about her. Okay. A lot of spouses aren't at that point when they first get hit with a discovery. They just get blindsided by it. They got the profile of someone who's been raped,
Right.
psychological profile,
Yep.
I just know what it was like when discovering our daughter's addiction that, I had some PTSD from around that. Now that's my daughter. Okay. Someone that I love, she's came from me and my wife and out of our love.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Someone I deeply care about. It's another thing when it's your spouse where you got that spiritual union, okay, that comes in marriage. It's physical, emotional, and spiritual union. And to have something like that come in there is like taking a paper and just ripping it in half.
Right.
Okay. So most people that have been betrayed, it's really hard on them. It's traumatic. It is deeply, deeply traumatic. And they, I understood what I felt like when we discovered our daughter's addiction, how traumatic that was. I can't, just ramp that up like about 2 or 3 orders of magnitude,
Mm-hmm.
For the spouse. So that's why you cannot forget the family members whenever an addiction is discovered. Okay. It is just absolutely critical that you look at every single person in the family, whether it's the spouse, the parents, the siblings, the children, whatever, everyone gets affected in different ways, but they get affected some degree, to more degrees than others, but everyone gets affected. Okay.
And that's why I'm just thinking that's where, having a trained professional come alongside the family and work with them, because as you described your own childhood and the different roles that the kids can play or labels they can
Yeah.
have. I'm thinking, being the lost child, or you're quiet, you don't dare share how you're feeling or any of these other things. So without the hindsight or without the benefit of a trained professional to be
Yeah.
able to pull that from that kid that would otherwise appear to be
Yeah.
doing okay with it, just because he or she's not raging out or losing their mind or whatever, doesn't mean they're not affected from it. So
Yeah. You reminded me. One of the things family counselor said, you talk about having a benefit of counselors and also life coaches, people that are trained in this type of stuff are absolutely critical, as well as going to meetings and getting a sponsor and doing all those other things. Okay. But if you can do those things, it's like the trifecta. You've hit the jackpot when you do all those things. So, I grew up in the age of Saturday morning cartoons,
yeah.
right? And that type of stuff. So, family counselor was talking one time about that the dynamic in our family with regards to our daughter was that as the way she described it, is that everyone in this family is dancing around your daughter about her needs, what she wants, reacting. Everyone is reacting to her, right? And it's like she's the one calling the shots, and we're all dancing around her.
Okay.
So this image came to mind, you know, the old Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the characters in there, remember Yosemite Sam?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. And, he's got his two, Colt 45 revolvers, and there'd be times he'd be giving Bugs a hard time, and he starts shooting at his feet and say, dance, dance, right? And that, for some reason, that image came to mind, that it was like our daughter, she was literally firing the bullets at us emotionally. Okay. And we were all dancing around to her, to try to avoid them bullets and that type of stuff. Never realizing that what we needed to do was to take the guns out of her hand. And that's what family recovery looks like, is learning how to take the guns out of, someone's hands who's really struggling at the moment and they just cannot help themselves. We discovered our daughter's addiction when she was 17 years old. She had the body of a 17-year-old girl, right? The studies also say that a person's emotional maturity stops when they start using.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? She started using when she was around 14 years old. So she got a 17-year-old body. She's got a 14-year-old emotional landscape that she's living in. And spiritually, she was a 2-year-old. Totally self-centered, because that's what addiction does. Okay? She, at that time, you couldn't trust her with anything. She didn't really consider anybody else's feelings and that type of stuff. The AAs use the term the king baby, right?
King baby?
King baby. Okay. The king is ruling the roost, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is emotionally like a baby.
Yeah.
That was a horrifying realization, right? That our daughter was in that state. So so one last God shot. So we were at a family. This is like about a year and a half after discovery. She had gone down to the rehab center for the extended one, eventually came back. She was saying all the right words, but she wasn't sober. She wasn't clean, emotionally. She was just dry. She just hadn't used.
Okay.
But she really had not grabbed a hold of recovery yet. And she relapsed within 2 weeks of coming back to town. Okay. And we discovered that in a very spectacular way a month later. So just so happened we had another one of those family weekends where we go as a family, and she's fresh off of this relapse, right? And being discovered at it. So there's like about 40 people. We're all families working through all these different issues and the psychodrama type of thing, and when you got skilled professionals, it's a very powerful healing technique. So they asked my wife, said, okay, it's your turn. And starts walking my wife through our daughter's relapse. And Jill is getting more and more worked up as she's talking. And this counselor is starting to probe a little deeper as to what's going on inside of Jill as a result of all this sort of stuff. And eventually was able to press down, burrow to the point. You're saying, Jill, what is your biggest fear that you have right now? And she said, my fear is that I will be standing next to my daughter's coffin looking at her dead body.
Right. Yeah.
And then she screamed. It was a gut-wrenching cry. It was so loud it could have split the wall. And everyone in the room was crying. I was crying. My daughter was crying. After a couple minutes, things kind of settled down. So now we're all standing in a circle. My wife is on one side, her daughter is on the other side of me. And the counselor turns to our daughter and says, "When you heard your mom scream like that, what were you feeling?" Instantly, the very first words out of her mouth was, "I feel like I want to use."
Yeah.
Right? For me, I just had this rage build up. And it's almost like an explosive detonation of rage. It's like, that's why she's screaming, because you want to use, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was to the point, Chad, where I had my left fist balled up and I was going to give her one of those Bruce Lee backhands, to the face like you see in the old kung fu movies,
Yeah.
right? And I was just going to lay her out because I was just so stinking angry, right? And just before I threw the punch, God spoke to me and my heart broke for her. And what he said was, "No, you know what it's like to be an addict." That because I knew how much our daughter really did love my wife. That has never been in doubt that she really loved her mom. And even in the face of seeing my wife in such agony, that her only go-to that she had to deal with her distress at seeing her mom was like that was to use, that broke my heart.
Yeah.
Finally, I had empathy for her. It was like, yeah, it really sucks to be an addict. It's a hard life. And it's not something to be judged. It's something to give people an out. Say, there's a better way. Follow me. Okay. It's like one beggar showing another beggar where to find bread.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me show you some people that can help you. Okay. And that's set the tone for the rest of my life, and how I deal with people in addictions.
One of the things that you had talked about was the lovely dinner you were having out on the back porch.
Oh, okay.
And wife asked you if you've had any, ever had any issues with pornography, and
Yeah.
and you were able to be honest with her because God was very instructive to not lie.
Yes. Very instructive. Yes.
And you honored that by listening to him.
Yeah.
So, so I want to pick up from there as to what it, I mean, you did mention, that, she was, she received it. She was, loving towards you. And was there additional questions that came with that? There was, curiosity on her part. What's the next steps? What's it been like, the work that you've been doing since you said you were doing some 12-step work?
Okay.
Yeah.
So from that point, by that time we were seeing a family counselor, originally for, dealing with the effects of our daughter's addiction. Okay. And thankfully this lady was not only skilled in all the family stuff, but she was also skilled in working with various types of addictions. She was very familiar with what sex addiction was all about, and I was trained to do that as well. So I made the commitment and actually started executing on it that, I started seeing the family counselor. We were already seeing a family counselor, but to start talking about that part of my journey as well. And so I started sharing stuff with her that I never shared with anybody else. Okay. And then it was a couple months later that I got a chance to go to one of these family weekends, the same one that my wife had gone to, where she got grips with her drinking. And by that time, she had started going to AA and got a sponsor and started doing all that sort of stuff, started rocking and rolling in her recovery, and has been ever since. So, my wife is what they call a first nighter. From the first night of going to an AA meeting, she has stayed sober that entire time,
Okay.
up through this day. So, I gone to one of these weekend things, and that's as we're going around the circle and introducing ourselves. And it got to me and said, "Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm a sex addict." Never thought those words would come flying out of my mouth.
I bet.
Right? Never thought that would happen. But I was in a safe space, and by that time, God had convicted me that, yep, this is exactly what I'm dealing with, and there is help. So it's time to start chasing after what that help looks like, right? And so, that was one of the things I worked on during this weekend. So I'm talking with one of these counselors who happened to be one of the counselors for a daughter. And as she was now in this recovery house down south, not recovery house, recovery facility down south. And and so I knew who this lady was. And by that time, I had started sharing some of my stuff with my daughter. And she said, "Chris, you need to get to Sexaholics Anonymous meeting." And I just started whining. He says, "I'm already going to all these other meetings. I'm seeing counselors. I'm going to these Al-anon meetings like several nights a week." And I'm just whining. And she looked me dead ass in the eye and said, "Chris, you got to go to these meetings." I was like, oh, okay, I'll go. Right. And I did. So my very first meeting is in a church downtown. Not the greatest section of town. Go walking in this place. This is an old church. You know how old churches have that 100-year-old mold smell?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this one had it big time, right? Go walking. They say, the meeting, found out that the meeting was, it got to go up a lonely flight of steps, go to the end of a hallway, and then there's a conference room there. So I go walking up these steps, creaking and old carpet, smelling moldy. See this long hallway with classrooms on the other side, completely abandoned. There is nobody in there. The lights are out. At the end of the hallway, I see these double doors for a conference room with a slit of light between them about that thick. And that's all I see. I think to myself, what is on the other side of those doors? Because I literally hadn't a clue of what a 12-step meeting like that would work. I'm familiar with codependent recovery, but not anything like that. Yet, I not only made the commitment, but I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. I was sick and tired of this addiction kicking my ass. I was sick and tired of lying, by deception with my wife. I was sick and tired of hiding in general. I was sick and tired of when I would go on a bender. See, my MO was that I could go dry from watching pornography for a couple months, 12 months. And the longest run I had of being dry was 18 months. But then something would trigger me, get that triggering thought. And after a couple of weeks, I would just start picking up and I would go on a pornography binge that would just rip me to shreds. I was maybe getting a couple hours of sleep a night. This would go on for a week to 2 weeks, sometimes 3. I'd just be on this jag and I was just going and going and going. I'd lose like 10 to 15 pounds and I was exhausted by the very end. And finally, just out of sheer exhaustion, I would stop. I was like, I kept on praying. This is before recovering all these realizations that God gave me. I was like, oh, I hope that was the last one. I don't know if I can take another one of these things. I mean, this is brutal. And then I heard this little voice in the back of my head just laughing, says, "Just you wait. There'll be another one." Right? That was the enemy of my soul talking to me. Okay? The great deceiver, the liar, was lying to me. And there's another one there, and it's a half truth. I know that as a recovering addict, I do have one more left in me. Okay. If I choose to, I can go back out there and do it. It's not like I'm incapable of relapsing.
Mm-hmm.
I know I can. Just plain and simple. I know I can. But it's not a prophecy. Okay. It's not that I will relapse. that I get a daily reprieve. It's from the big book. I get a daily reprieve based upon the fitness of my spiritual condition. And if I continue to work, the work of recovery and trusting God in all of this and doing what He's telling me to do in the moment, then I can and I will stay sober. And if I choose to not do that, well, then that's another story, and that's a very painful story. I'm so glad that God gave me that really painful moment back in the beginning of the journey when I was terrified of dying in this addiction. Because sometimes when I start to get close, to going over the edge, because I can do that. There were a couple times I gotten really close to the edge of wanting to act out. That thought came to mind. I said, Chris, remember what it was like to be face down on the carpet in abject terror that this was going to be the rest of your life. And that kind of wakes me up. I said, do I want to go back there again? As a friend of ours, Hank, would say, I spent a lot of energy, worked really hard just to get to where I'm, was fighting this hard battle. Why would I want to cede all that territory back to the enemy? Right. Why do I want to give it away back to him when I fought so hard to get here? So it's those type of things that help me to change my focus from myself and my addictive thinking and personality to my higher power, Jesus Christ. When I start doing that, then I now have this inexhaustible source of power on my side. So, I go to my first meeting and I walk through those doors, not knowing what was on the other side. And what I found, a bunch of folks who were like me. Our stories were not identical, but there was enough of a commonality where I could identify with them. And they could identify with me. And there's some people there that had less sobriety than me and some people that had more sobriety than me. And collectively, everyone, just by sharing their own stories and starting to do the work of recovery, getting a sponsor, working the steps, being a service, praying, reaching out to others, reading the literature, doing all those things that people who have successful recoveries do. When I started doing those things, I realized I got a whole bunch of friends, right? I find it amazing that I can go into a 12-step meeting, especially in my home group, and there are people there that, for the most part, now some people I know deeper than others, right? But for the most part, I don't know what city they were born in, where they were born, even if they were born in this country. I don't know what university they went to, or even if they went to university. I don't know what their occupations are, right? I don't know who their favorite sports teams are. There's a lot of things that when we talk about our friends, right? Oh, I know this guy. Those are the things that we normally know. Where they come from, where they go to school.
Yeah.
Who do like to root for, right? Or who do they root against, right? And we try to find these common bonds with other people based upon these kind of superficial aspects, right? Yet I can be surrounded by these people who I know none of that about them, but this is what I do know. I know what their struggles are. I don't know what their victories are. I know what their insights are on how to live a life of victory. Okay? I know what it's, by their example, I've learned how to be brutally honest with myself and with other people. I learned how to make amends when I've trashed somebody relationally, right? I know all these things about these other people, right? In many cases, I don't even know their last name.
I was just thinking that.
I might not even know the first initial of their last name. So all this stuff that the culture tells us is that this is how you know somebody. That ain't how you know somebody. You really get to know somebody when you have this type of honest sharing with each other and lifting each other up and giving people the space to tell their story, right? And so I started experiencing that, and I was no longer alone. I mean, really alone. Prior to that point, I could be the type of guy, I could be in a room with 200 people and feel completely alone, because for me, loneliness is not a statement of physical proximity. Are the people near me or not near me, right? If everyone is miles away or something like that, I'm lonely. No, I can be in solitude with nobody around, and that's an okay thing. It's actually a spiritual discipline to be able to be in solitude, right? To have a moment of peace and to be with God. What But I didn't know what solitude was. For me, loneliness was a lack of connection with other people, which is not a statement of physical nearness, proximity, right? So I learned how to be in a group of people and not be lonely anymore by sharing and hearing other people's uh, stories. Going to the meeting before the meeting, like grabbing breakfast with people, or going for coffee after a meeting or something like that. I learned how to really make real connections with other people, and I was no longer alone, right? And the only person that I could be with other than that and not feel alone would be with my wife. Okay. But now I could do this with other people. I don't even have to be married to them. Right. So,
Right. Well, that rings true to, we're only as sick as our secrets.
yeah.
And so, 'cause as you were talking, I was prepared to ask, like, well, what's keeps the men of the world, or we'll even just stick with our country, of the ability to connect, on that level, and then God revealed the answer as you continue talking of, like, we're only sick as our secrets. So yeah, of course we're not going to want to you know open up and talk at that level, because
Yeah.
we don't want to we don't want to open up our what our secrets are. So in the 12-step rooms, if you're coming there, you're at your wits end, hopefully you're rock bottom, and you're trying to get wanting to get help. So you have to be able to open up
Yeah.
and get those secrets out, so that ability to connect then happens.
Yeah. And the reason why it happens, there's an excellent book written on the topic of shame by a gentleman named Kurt Thompson. Kurt with a K, that is. I'm going to give a shout out to you, Mr. Thompson, because you've been really influential in my life. Okay. And he wrote a book called The Soul of Shame. And he talked about shame both from the clinical perspective as well as the emotional and relational perspective. And one of the big ideas in his book is that shame causes disintegration. And he described it as happening at multiple levels. First, it starts at the personal level, that shame causes disintegration, that various parts of my brain are no longer playing nicely with each other. Okay. To integrate, the word integrate means to take various things and jam them together and make a unit out of it. Okay. Make them into one thing, right? Well, disintegration is a reverse process where things fall apart, right? And so, like, my emotions are no longer playing with my cognitive function, my spirit. They're all now at odds with each other because of shame, because I'm thinking to myself that I'm fundamentally and irreconcilably flawed with no hope of anything better. That's really what shame is. It's an attack on my identity. It's like I'm no longer a child of God, or never was, right? And that I'm just basically a hopeless piece of crap. Nobody wants to be around me. I'll never be good enough. If I screw up, they say, well, there you go again. You'll never learn. There's just, you know, this voice of shame, is something that had been really big in my life for a long time. Okay. It causes disintegration personally and then interpersonally. And this is why it came to mind when you talk about this, because when I'm in a shame spiral, I don't want to share that crap with anybody else, right? So I ain't sharing anything at all. And people are wondering, well, why is this knucklehead off in the corner not saying anything or not contributing to the conversation? You know, to the outside world, I appear like I'm being aloof, right? Or completely disinterested, or, you're even judgmental and contemptuous of the people around me. When really what I'm doing is I'm dealing with shame. Okay. Because I know that there's something going on inside of me that I just do not want to share. And I don't even want to take the risk of somebody asking a question where I feel compelled to either expose myself or to lie.
Right.
Right. And both of those options sound, when I'm in shame, both of those options seem very dangerous to me. So it's better to avoid the situation and not even get close there. And the miracle of recovery is that it's a shame buster, amongst other things. Okay. That when I can hear other people's stuff and it's a safe place where I can share my stuff, then that shame starts to roll off. I don't, because shame can only exist where lies are and where darkness is. And that's why we're only as sick as our secrets, right? When I start telling our secrets to save people, then life gets better. So speaking of safe people, okay. So I was in a meeting one time. This is actually an Al-anon meeting, and I heard somebody say something. I thought, it's kind of really cool motto, slogan, which is very helpful to me, and that is that a burden shared is halved and a joy shared is doubled. Right? It's like, yeah, I've experienced that. So then I go into an SA meeting and I happen to share that little nugget of wisdom. And somebody after the meeting walked up to me and said, well, Chris, that's not always true. I was like, what? He says, it depends on who you're sharing with. Some people are not safe to share with. And I thought to myself, when you got the wrong person, that a joy shared is halved and a burden shared is doubled.
Yeah, if you want, if you get somebody to co-sign on your complaining and your self-pityness and all this other stuff, makes sense.
Or you share something really deep with somebody, get real vulnerable, and then you hear a week later somebody else sharing it with you. Say, hey, I heard this about you. How you doing now, right? You find out that someone gossiped something that was supposed to be held in confidence. Okay, so that's why going to, one of the powers of being in a 12-step meeting is because of that rule of confidentiality, the practice of what's said in the room stays in the room, right? And that I have no right to share somebody else's story unless they have given me prior permission. But to never assume that. So that's why it's so important to get to meetings, is to start getting all that crap that's inside of my head and my heart out into the air where it can come to light. So here's a couple other vignettes, stories from recovery. So this is now with the codependent side of things. So we're kind of rocking and rolling in recovery and that type of stuff. And I'm having a conversation with my bride, and she says something about something that was going on. She says, oh, but you probably are thinking this, right?
Right. Yeah.
And, one of the things I learned in codependent recovery is I not only need to learn how to detach with love from the addicts in my life, I also need to learn how to detach with love from the codependents in my life. So my wife, by this time, her recovery in AA was going great. It still is. but she had work to do on the codependent side. And so she says this, oh, you're probably thinking this, that, and the other. Well, first off, I wasn't thinking any of that at all. So I decided to kind of play with this a little bit. I said, I wasn't thinking that, but I took her hand, put her hand on my head, said, okay, what am I thinking? Right? And she looks at me kind of puzzled and she says, I don't know. I says, that's right. And I said, not only that, you don't want to get inside of my head because it's dark and slimy in there. There's all sorts of squishy things in there that you don't want to touch. I said, and more importantly, if you're in my head, you're out of your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And she just kind of looked at me like, slack jawed for a second and then started laughing. And she says, you are exactly right. That's why I do this. Because when she's trying to get inside of my head, that means that she doesn't have to be in her head.
Right.
And that was an instructive lesson for both of us, because that's kind of like the nature of codependency is by getting involved in other people's stuff, taking care of their business, and trying to control them or trying to fix them or something like that. While all that's going on, I'm distracted from what's really happening in my heart. And that's why codependent behavior can be as compulsive as using heroin or smoking crack or acting out with pornography or any of the other addictions. And so it's been a wild journey, Okay, here's another vignette. Okay. Getting back to, we had talked about my growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it came time to do step 9 the first time. That's where I made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Excuse me a second. So both my parents were on the list. By that time, both my parents had passed away years beforehand. And so we can't make direct amends with them. Yet there were things, the attitudes, the judgmental nature I had towards my mom because of her addictions and not really understanding what she was going through. And kind of like the distant relationship I had with my dad for a long time. And then, and my relationship with my dad really reconciled within the last 7 years of his life. And so we had a great relationship by the time he had passed. But, there'd been a lot of turmoil and there were a lot of things I had to answer for of how I lied to my parents, and kind of snuck around and did things that they never knew had happened. And so my sponsor said, in this case, what a lot of people do is they will write a letter, to the deceased parent or someone else that's no longer there, either physically, something like that. Excuse me a second. It's something irritating me. Okay, so he said, write a letter, and make your amends that way. And I actually got a pad and a pencil and started to write. And said, something doesn't feel right here for me. And so it's a valid thing to do. And I know other people have done that and have been great for them, right? I said, no, there's something different I have to do here. This is not the right thing. And so I thought about it a little bit, shared the idea with my sponsor. He said, okay, that makes sense. So this is what I did. My wife and I went for a long walk on a nature trail near where we live. It was a beautiful day. And while we were walking, I asked my wife if she could help me do a step 9 for my parents. She said, okay, what's that mean? In this case, I said, I realized that every time I've been in a meeting and I said anything about my parents, it's always been about the pain. Okay, it's always been about the dysfunction, the tough things that happened, right? Every single time I referenced my parents, it was viewed through a lens of pain. And I said, and that is not the full story of who they were. I've come to understand how much they really loved us. And so I said, so if you're willing, my 9-step amends would be for me to tell you all the wonderful things that they did in my life and how much they really cared for me. She said, I would be honored. And for almost an hour, I just started pouring out all the wonderful things. One of the miracles of recovery for me has been to see past the pain of my life and to see the good things that happened as well. And you even asked those questions earlier in this thing is, it couldn't have been all bad. There must have been some good things that happened, right? I was able to recount those things. And the blessing was that, and this is the way a friend of mine who's a pastor described it in a sermon. He said that pain is like having a hand in your face like this, right? And it so dominates the picture. It's really hard for me to see anything else other than the pain that's like right here. It says, and what faith in Christ starts to do, it starts to take the hand away. So now I can see everything that's beyond it. And there might be some other pain out there, but I get to see the beauty of it, right? I get to see the beauty of a sunset. I get to see the beauty, of a young mother and child in a park. I get to see the beauty of a job well done at work, right? Of a successful negotiation or a successful delivery, right? I get to see the beauty of being able to have a minute's rest and read a book in peace, right? Without having the radio blaring. I get to see a lot of these different things. And I got to see, as I started dealing with the pain of my life, I got to see my parents for who they really were. I got to see my siblings for who they really were and my grandparents. Okay. And, beautiful people with issues, right? Kind of like me, right? But I got to see the beauty of the relationships that I never could see before because I was still carrying the resentment and shame and all that other stuff, from the past. And by the time I was done, I was in tears. My wife was in tears. And I felt so much freer. Okay. And I love to share that story because it's a powerful thing. It's a sign of healing. It goes to show that I can not only seek forgiveness and I have reconciliation, the person doesn't have to be near me or even be alive for me to reconcile, a relationship with someone else. Because ultimately, when it comes to reconciliation, all it really means, it doesn't mean that you go necessarily mean that you go arm in arm off into the future, and everything's great and wonderful. To me, reconciliation is the war is effing over. That's it. That's the reconciliation. Is like cut the ties with the past and all of its pain and all of its angst and all that other mess, right? It said, I am willing to go forward from this day and the war is over.
It's a good way to look at it. I hadn't thought about that, and I don't know. In all the time that we've spent together, that's ever a way you describe it. At least not that I'm recalling, but I like that. Reconciliation is the war is over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I've seen, I've been in recovery now for 17 years, and I've seen a lot of people. Let's say several thousand people, probably. And I have seen some absolutely beautiful things happen, a reconciliation of relationships. And that doesn't necessarily mean like the husband and wife got remarried, right? Sometimes it's like, well, they can now be in each other's presence without throwing rocks.
Yeah.
Or a knife or something like that. So, verbally or physically, right? So that's a miracle in and of itself, right? And so it's really wild to watch this happen in real time. You know,
So what's the family dynamic now? You've got substantial or what I would consider substantial time in recovery. It sounds like that's the case for your wife. Sounds like that's
mm-hmm,
the case for your daughter.
mm-hmm.
And you haven't said anything as far as a recovery type story for your son. But not but and I'm assuming that there's substantial recovery for him because there's just been family healing
Yeah,
altogether. So it's not just been the three of you; it's been the four
yeah,
of you in the healing
absolutely.
process.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was in the back of my mind that, you know, when we first discovered our daughter's addiction, we knew, we realized almost instantly that we have to be really careful about focusing so much on our daughter and her recovery that we neglect our son
Hmm.
and leave him in the lurch. Okay. So we're very mindful in going to getting him, see the family counselor as well, you know, you know, in an age appropriate manner, that type of stuff, to make sure that we included him in things, right? That we didn't, we weren't just dropping him off at my mother-in-law's or with neighbors and for days on end or something like that, that we're actively involved in his life and, supporting any of his personal activities and that type of stuff. And so um, he hasn't displayed any signs of addiction per se. I don't think he's got the genetics for at least the chemical addiction type of thing. And he was affected by the whole family dynamic. And I won't get into what that looks like or something like that. Um, and I see him doing um, tremendous work on his own as he deals with his attitudes. And I'm really proud of my son. So is my wife. He is doing well for himself. And I'm not saying so much like financial, like he's got millions of dollars, like he's a tech bro or something like that, and has patents and all that. No, I'm not talking about that. But he's built a solid life, okay, and he's got a great sense of humor, and in fact, there's one time. So, two stories related to that. Okay, so the first one was, he's picked up recovery by osmosis, basically seeing it. My wife and I live it out, and his sister living out recovery. And so, one time, my wife goes walking into his bedroom, and it is just an absolute wreck. Okay, and and she kept on, you know, she and I would lean on him once in a while. I said, yeah, at least make it so you can walk around in the room without tripping. Okay, it doesn't have to. Everything doesn't have to look ship shaped like a naval ship. And I said, but at least make it safe to walk around, right? Which was a challenge for him apparently. So one day she says, "Your room is a wreck," right? And he just looked at my wife dead in the eye and said, "Well, it is what it is." And she said, "That crap ain't flying here, son. Get it cleaned up." Right? So, so he was kind of playing with her and that type of stuff, and so they had a chuckle with that. And here's a little more important one, and this also shows the importance of boundaries. Okay, because boundaries or lack thereof, or not respecting other people's boundaries, that's a big issue for folks like us. For families that have addiction running through it, is boundaries. That's a really poorly understood concept. And in the final analysis, a boundary is basically What behavior am I willing or not willing to accept in my presence? That's all it is. It's about my protection. It's not about controlling other people. It's just, what is my protection? Okay. So one of my boundaries is that if there is something going on between my wife and my son, I don't have to get involved. I don't have to rescue my wife or anyone else in that relationship anymore. Okay. So the first boundary I have is, I don't insert myself into any of their discussions. Okay. So we're getting ready for people coming over for a dinner. Several couples were coming over, and we were behind schedule getting ready. So life is starting to get a little frantic as we're scrambling around to make sure that everything's ready. And my wife really takes this stuff to heart. It's like everything's got to be shipshape and it's got to be done right and all this stuff. And so our son at this time is like about 15 years old. And while this is all going down and we're scrambling in the kitchen to get everything ready, he's on his Xbox playing a video game of some sort. And my wife goes to, put some dishes in the dishwasher, and the thing's fully loaded with clean dishes. He was supposed to empty that out like 2 hours beforehand. So now she's frustrated, and she says, she interrupts his game and says, "You got to empty this dishwasher like right now." And he says, "I'm in the middle of a game, right?" She says, "No, you said you were going to empty it, and we need to empty like right now." Okay. And so they start getting into it. And so I'm trying to hold my boundary of, they got to figure it out themselves. I have no right to jump in there and try to manage the situation. I'll just make it worse, right? It's not my right. And they're going back and forth, and I'm still trying to do my thing. And all of a sudden, I hear my son F-bomb my wife.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh is right. Okay. Now here's the boundary. The second boundary. The second boundary was, I get really disturbed when people curse at each other in anger in my presence. It really disturbs me on the inside. Okay. I just will not tolerate that type of language in my presence. That's a boundary. All right. And my son just crossed it, and he just crossed it big time. Now, here's where recovery comes in, because prior to something like that, what I would have done, I would have gotten his face like about that far from his nose. There would have been 3 or 4 veins popping off of my forehead. I would be yelling so much that spit would be hitting him in the face. Say, "How dare you talk to my wife like that? That is a woman I love, and you are not going to talk to her like that." And just start ripping him up one side and down the others, right? But recovery kicked in instead, and I walked up to him. I pointed and I said, "You follow me." Right? He knew I meant business, so he got up off his game, and he follows me into the garage. And instead of yelling at him, I said, "Son, you have a choice to make." He says, "Right now we are behind schedule, and your mom is going crazy because she is so terrified that we're not going to be ready in time for our guests. Okay. And your choice is, you can join her in the craziness, or, by reacting and yelling at her, or you can go back in and you can do what you committed to do 2 hours ago. The choice is yours." And then I walked out of the garage. 10 seconds later, he comes walking in. He starts unloading the dishwasher. When he was done, he then turned to my wife and said, "Do you need me to vacuum or anything like that?" And Jill just looks at him like, what the hell just happened? What did my husband say to him so that, to change this so quickly, right? And she even had this scenario. She told me later, she had this scenario planned, and in the middle. He said, well, you better go in there because your mom is PMSing right now, and she's really going to tear you apart if you don't go in and clean, and empty that dishwasher, right? But that's not what I said. It wasn't. I put he was old enough to be able to make a rational adult decision. Is he going to be a man of integrity and do what he said, or is he just going to continue to slug it out, get angry, and cause all sorts of relational havoc, right? And he made the wise choice. He decided to be a man of integrity. He was going to do what he said, honor his commitment, do that, and then took the next step beyond that and said, how else may I be of service? Do you need me to vacuum, right? So, end of the night, we had a nice time with all of our guests, right? Everything was ready by the time they showed up. We had a really nice time. We clean up, go upstairs to the bedroom, or what? My wife looks at me and says, what the hell did you tell them out in that garage? I just told you what I just told you, right? That's what I told her. And she said, you are absolutely right. I was going crazy in there. So I got to make amends to Alex as well because of the way I was treating him. He said, that was not right. But you were absolutely right. I was terrified that of looking like a fool in front of our guests. And that's why I reacted so negatively towards him, he said. And so she owned her part of it as well. And what's the beautiful thing about that? I didn't have to tell either one of them how to fix it. And I didn't have to tell either of them what they should do. I just pointed out who had the choice. That's all I did. That was the only contribution I had. And then let God do the rest. And for me, that's a huge victory because I thought it was my responsibility was to fix these type of problems, right? Ain't my job. It's not my circus, not my monkeys, right?
Well, like you said earlier, that once you learn to get out of the way and let God do what he's going to do,
mm-hmm.
things tend to be far better off.
Mm-hmm.
And same for me, and I'm sure for anybody who's watching or listening, the same thing. We have to get out of our own way in order to be better.
Yeah.
And that even goes for our own recovery, just for our own stuff, not even relationally with other people, but relationally with our own self.
Yeah.
We have to stop trying to control ourselves and that self-will, because eventually that's going to run out and it needs to be filled up again.
Yeah. So here's another recovery story. You kind of reminded me of that. Okay. And it's along the lines of being self-aware and having personal honesty, with myself. So this is relatively early in the recovery journey. Our daughter was now out of state and had been out of state for a while she was in this long-term program. And in that time, I told you how we sold our house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and how amazing that was. So while she was out of state, that's when we moved. Okay. So now she was coming back to town for a weekend to do one of these family recovery sessions like we told you before about, how I came to grips with my stuff and my wife came to grips with her stuff. So she, flew from out of state with a friend who came along for support, since this would be the first time our daughter was coming back since she had been away. And so my wife I was working at my job and I couldn't get off that day. So my wife goes to pick her up at the airport. They decide to go someplace for lunch. I took off a little early from work so I could be home, so I could greet my daughter, because I really hadn't seen her other than in therapeutic environments. I hadn't really seen her for like about 4 or 5 months. And I was so looking forward to seeing her, right? And without having the counselors around and just being a little less structured, right? And so there's I hear him knocking on the door, and it's like, okay. So I go open up the door. Daughter comes walking in. She's got her friend with her, and my wife is a couple steps behind her. And the first thing that happens is the family dog comes running up, right? And starts jumping and, licking our daughter and that type of stuff. And she hadn't seen the dog and since she got whisked away to recovery, like 6 months beforehand. So she was like all excited to see the dog, right? Then she looks around, she sees the new house, and she's like, wow, this is a nice place. This is wonderful, right? And she's walking around with her friend and pointing out, oh, look at this and look at that. She blew right by me without even saying, hi, Dad. Just right past me. At the time, and I still am, 6 feet 4 inches tall in physical length, right? That's my height, but I felt about that big by the time she walked past me. Inside, I just shrunk. And I went quiet. And I was quiet the whole evening. Okay. After they showed up, then my mother in law also showed up with a family friend. Okay. And so it was kind of like a second grandmother to our daughter. And so now I got this house full of people, and I am really struggling emotionally inside. So everyone else is yapping. So, I'm the only our son was there, but he was still kind of young, and he like went off play a video game while all the ladies are yapping. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4, 5 ladies are, talking back and forth and animated conversation, that type of stuff. And I ain't participating in any conversation. And then I decide, well, I'm going to clear the table, and I'm going to wash the dishes. Not because I need it to be done, but because it's a convenient way of removing myself from a situation, right? And then when I was done with all that sort of stuff, I did something that I learned to do when I was a kid growing up in this chaotic house, old of mine. And that was I learned how to disappear from a room. I go 6 feet 4. I can walk out of a room and nobody knows I'm gone until a half an hour later. Where'd he go? Right? It's a skill that I really honed to a fine art, and I lapsed right back into it. I just disappeared from the room. Go upstairs. I'm laying in bed, and I'm trying to distract myself by doing a Sudoku puzzle. And that wasn't working. And after like about 5-10 minutes, I just put that book down, and I actually said this aloud. Nobody around me. I just said this aloud. I said, I hate where I'm at. I really do. I just hate where I'm at right now. And that wasn't a statement of that I hate being in this house or in this room right now. That was a statement of my emotional state. I hated where I was emotionally. And I was just, had shrunk internally. And I was just beating myself up. And I really wasn't clear on why that was. So, one of the things I've learned in technical problem solving is a cute little trick. It's called the 5 whys, as in why, not the letter Y, but it's the question word why, right? And the studies show in industry that if you ask the question, well, why is this happening? And somebody gives you an answer, and then you say, well, why is that happening? And then you keep on asking the why. So the studies show that by the time you ask the 5th why, you have a very high probability of getting to the root cause of the issue.
Okay.
It's a really helpful personal skill as well. When I'm disturbed, like it says in the big book, whenever I'm disturbed, whenever I'm disturbed, it's because of some person, place, thing, or situation which I found unacceptable. And I will have no peace until I accept that take that person, place, thing, or situation as exactly as God has intended it that nothing, absolutely nothing happens in God's world by mistake, right? Which is another way of saying what Paul wrote. All things happen to the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose, right? So I started asking the 5 whys of myself. Okay, why are you feeling this way? Why do you hate where you're at right now? I said, because my daughter blew right by me and didn't even say hello, and I was really looking forward to, to seeing her. Okay, Chris, why is that a problem? Well, because I felt ignored. Why is that a problem? Because I feel insignificant. And why is that a problem, Chris? And it was like, because that is how I have always felt. And then, like in the game shows, when somebody gets the right answer, the bell lights start flashing and the bells start going ding, 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 and all that sort of stuff, rather than right? The bell started going off in my head and the lights started flashing. It says, that is it. That is why I shrunk, because she triggered those old feelings of feeling insignificant and I'm not worthy of other people's love or even their attention. Okay. And so once I realized that, I started going to God and say, okay, well, this is a lie. What's your truth? And his truth is that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, that I'm loved so much that he went to the cross for me and died for my sins, okay, as well as other people's sins, but he died for me as well, okay, and that he has promised to never leave me or abandon me, right, that he will even rejoices over me with singing, okay. These are all truths out of God's word. And I started taking a hold of those in this situation, saying, okay, started speaking truth to me to counteract the lies that I was believing, because I'm not, in the eyes of God, I'm not insignificant, right? That's a lie from the pit of hell. So I started feeling a lot better about that, and starting getting to a much better place of peace. So at the end of the night, our daughter was staying with us for the next night, and then we were all going to head together for this family weekend thing with the recovery house. And she walked into the bedroom because she needed to get something from the master bathroom, my wife's, that she was going to borrow. She walks by and she just says, "Hi, Dad." I said, "How you doing, sweetie?" She said, "I'm okay." But it was a kind of a brief and awkward discussion. So the next morning, we're now jumping in the car. We're now driving down into the city to do this. My wife, our daughter, and myself. We weren't more than 100 feet from pulling away from our driveway. Our daughter looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, are you mad at me?" And I thought for a second. I said, "No, honey, I'm not mad. I'm hurt." And I could be honest about that. Didn't need to sugarcoat. I just said, "I'm hurt." Because when you blew by me and, when you first got in, didn't even say hello or something like that, I was hurt. And she said, "I could see that." And I didn't know how to get out of it. When she realized that's what had happened, and she didn't know how to make that right. And so she started making amends to me. She said, "I'm so sorry," and that type of stuff. And I said, and I thanked her for that. I said, "I have to be honest." I said, the reason why I took it so hard was not so much you, it's me. You ended up stepping on one of my landmines, and you didn't know that you were stepping on one of my landmines. So my reaction to that, I own that. He says, and yeah, it would have been nice if you threw your arms around me and said, "Daddy, I love you. I'm so glad to be home." That would have been much nicer. And that's one of that's because I'd kind of had that picture in my mind,
Mm-hmm.
that it was going to be a warm welcome. And instead, it was cold as a block of dry ice. And dry ice hurts when you touch it.
Oh, yes, it does. It
Yeah.
burns.
Yeah. So, and that's what it felt like. So I'm just so thankful for the things that people have taught me in recovery, that I can look at this stuff and actually use these tools in my own life, and they actually work. Okay? They actually do work. And it's, and it's not just my life. I see it in the life, I see in your life. I see it in all the guys that we know and other people that you come across on YouTube and podcasts and things like that, or the stories that you read in recovery literature. This stuff actually works. God is present and alive and involved in every single one of our lives. If there's anything else I've learned in recovery, it's that fact that I am not an orphan and I got a loving daddy, and he is there with me all the time.
Amen.
Amen.
So where's or what does recovery look like for you now? As you mentioned the codependency part of it, working the 12 steps there. You mentioned about the SA for yourself, AA for your wife, assuming NA for your daughter.
Oh, yeah.
So everybody's still active in the recovery community.
Yeah. Just focus on our daughter. Our daughter, she was she started going to NA meetings when she came back from her last stint, and she got it. And so she first started living in sober houses, and then shared an apartment with a friend, a girl in recovery, and then eventually she met some guy who was also going to NA, and she kind of took a shine to the guy, and likewise for him, he thought she was a beautiful woman, which she is. It's not just a daddy talking. My daughter is a stunningly beautiful girl, now a woman. Okay, and so she meets this guy, and they get married, and they've had a successful marriage. They've been married now, let's see, probably like about 10 years, 10, 12 years. And we have, probably 12 years. And we got 2 granddaughters.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
And
nice.
they're 8 and 6. And we've nicknamed them the Twin Tornadoes because they are very active. Especially when they grab the toy bins out of the basement and dump them all over the living room floor,
Mm-hmm.
and that type of stuff. It takes 45 minutes to clean up after them, but hey, they're great kids and enjoy them. So our daughter and son-in-law are both active in their programs, and years ago, she started a sober house,
Hmm.
um, and like a lower middle class section of town. And, her husband's really good with real estate and that type of stuff. And they bought a distressed property, renovated it, and started a 12-bed recovery house. And because she saw how limited the resources were for women in recovery when it comes to drugs and alcohol. There's lots of facilities out there for men, but women present their own problems, especially if you have young children,
Mm-hmm.
involved as well. So, and that was kind of her experience of the limited options, and some of them weren't very good options that were out there. So she started this house, and it's grown to be, kind of like a reasonable operation, with counseling staff, resident assistant staff, and that type of stuff. And they're now developing a second house, do a similar type of thing. And that's her giving back to the community, you know. And I remember one time going over there for something else or something like that, and I saw her interacting with a girl who had just walked in the door, and within an hour there had been some sort of strife with one of the other residents there. And this girl was ready to bolt, and she had already bolted out of like 2 other houses. And this girl was in a really desperate spot. And I saw how my daughter could talk to this girl who was just so upset and get her calmed down and to acknowledge what her concerns really were and to work with her as to what would be acceptable solutions and that type of stuff. And to do it both with a directness and a kindness that I think is kind of rare in this world. Some people can be very direct,
Mm-hmm.
but they ain't very kind.
Right.
Or people think that kindness is being indirect, and that type of stuff. But she was real straightforward with this girl, but with this heart of love and empathy to someone who she had just met, right? And I was just blown away, by seeing my daughter do that, our daughter. And it just warmed my heart. So she helps a lot of other girls. Every year we go to her anniversary, she gets her key tag, which is their equivalent of handing out chips like in AA. Something like that. You get a key tag. And so she got hers it was like 2 months ago. She got her 16th.
Wow.
Wow.
That's
right.
awesome.
And, she had a lot of her sponsees were there. Her sponsor was there, and just, some family, some friends of hers, as well as people who are actually in the program. And they even let the parents in, let us in, right? And it's just really cool to see. And so that's kind of like how her recovery is going, and, she has struggled. She's worked through the struggle. I won't say she's struggling, but she has worked through the struggles of what led to originally to her addiction and then the consequences of that.
Mm-hmm.
And she has done tremendous work working through that, and being willing to go to those hard places, with the support of her NA friends, of counselors, and from us as well. Okay. So that's what it looks like for her. For my wife, she, well, first off, I'll talk about what we do jointly. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure I ever shared this story with you before, but I think it's a really powerful story. Okay. And that is, it was within several weeks of first discovering our daughter's addiction. I shared that with a friend of mine who ran a missions organization. And I'd known this guy. I'd actually gone overseas with him on a couple of short-term missions. And so we happened to cross paths, and I shared with him what was happening in my family and asked him to pray for us. And so we had a good conversation. Then he reached out to another guy that I knew who were also gone overseas as part of these trips. And the two of these guys, they organized a group of people for 30 days of persistent prayer for our family.
That's amazing.
Every Sunday for a month, 20 to 30 people got together specifically to pray for me, my wife, my son, and my daughter.
It's a lot of love.
Yes, it is. And that prayer was just so powerful. And we did not feel alone. And what I what we both realize in all that is we got this type of support because we just happen to know the right people within our church and our congregation that could organize this type of stuff, right? And how blessed we were by that. And then the horror set in that that's not the case for most people, right? Where do you turn? If you're a member of the church, where do you turn, right? Where do you go? Most people don't know what to do with addiction, right? They just don't understand it, or they think it's just a sin problem. It says, well, just stop doing that, right?
Right.
Right?
Pray more, be more faithful.
Yeah, yeah. Read your Bible more.
Yeah.
Okay, just turn it over to God. There's a name for that in recovery circles. It's called the Christian One-Step Recovery Program.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just hand it over to Jesus, right? Handing things over to Jesus is not so simple. There's a lot more to that handing over than just saying, I'm going to hand it over, because for the most part, I don't know how to hand over nothing. I have to learn how to do that. Okay.
Yeah, and the therapy that's there, the 12-step that's out there, just being in community of fellowship, the connecting with people who don't want to keep their sin a secret or anything like that. That's all because of God. That's all. Jesus has and God has given these talents to these people and these abilities to be there, to be the hands and feet and face of God to these people who need help. So
exactly.
I the same thing when I just early on in recovery was told you just need to hand it over to God. You need just get right with Jesus, and it really annoyed me because they're just like, okay, so how do I do that? What's next? Give me some tangible things to do.
Yeah.
So.
And so my wife and I both recognize that, that, in the churches that I grew up in or something like that, addiction, drug abuse, alcoholism, pornography, right? We don't talk about that type of stuff in church.
Dare.
That's not for decent folks to be dealing with, right? The church should be, and this is the call that Christ gave to the church, that we should be the first place where people come to when they're struggling. And most often, it's not only the last place they would go, it's the last place they would even conceivably imagine in their most tortured, fevered nightmares would someone think, oh, I got this problem, I'm going to go to church, right?
Right.
And so, Joe and I kind of has taken it as our life mission, amongst other things, is to help the church be the first place people go to. So the founding pastor of our church had started a recovery ministry at his previous church, and which we had attended. It wasn't, it was in the community where we used to live. But now that, where we live, we didn't have that option unless we wanted to drive like almost an hour to get there, which we did. Okay. But he wanted to start something like that up in our home church now. And so, went back and forth. It took a couple of years, but eventually, it was believed to be the right time to start the church. And Joe and I were asked to lead that ministry. And that was 13 years ago. And the studies show that most recovery ministries, they have dried up and gone away after 3 years. And we've been in 13 and going on to 14 years. I mean, it was so bizarre how things started. Our lead pastor decided to do a teaching series on counterfeit gods. It's from Tim Keller's book, Counterfeit Gods. Okay.
Familiar with it.
Yeah. And, where the idea is that all addiction is just a form of idolatry. You'd be absolutely right about that. And so, because our senior pastor is a man of recovery himself with 35 years now of recovery under his belt, he still works a pretty good program, a very good program, in fact. He decided to do this series on 12-step recovery. Every Sunday was a different step, you know. Can you imagine? It was actually 12 weeks long, right? Okay, so week one, powerless over our stuff, and our addictions, and lives have become unmanageable. So it's like on the Thursday before, he calls up my wife and says, "Can you share your testimony, recovery from alcohol?" And she saw us. At first, she didn't say anything. You even had to ask, "Are you still on the line?" She said, "Yeah, I'm here. I'm terrified." But she said, "Okay, I'll do it. When do you want to do it?" He said, "How about this Sunday?" It was Thursday morning he's calling her.
Wow, not much time.
No, not much time. And she said, actually, that was after getting over a shock. Like, what? This Sunday? He said, yeah. Actually turned out to be a blessing because she didn't have much time to overthink it.
Oh, yeah, that's
She
true.
just said, she thought about it, said, I'll do it. I think this is what God wants me to do. She sat down right at her laptop because he said, you got to write out your testimony. He wasn't going to let anybody wing it from the pulpit. So, okay, she did. She said the words just flowed out. She gets up there. She does her thing. She did a beautiful job. Okay. It's like a 10, 15-minute testimony. It was absolutely beautiful. And by the time she was done, she got a standing ovation from the people in the congregation. Right. And then there were people coming up afterwards saying, so when's this recovery ministry going to start? And he said, we're thinking in September after the summer break. Now, mind you, this was like end of May. Okay. And people are coming up there and saying, I can't wait till September. I can't stop drinking. I can't go 24 hours sober. And you want me to wait till September? I cannot wait that long. Her response was to walk them into an AA meeting that was happening that afternoon, right? But we started talking about it as a core team, development team for this. And we started getting the belief of maybe we need to accelerate this. So a couple of weeks goes by. It's like step 7 now. And pastor says, Chris, you want to share your story? I was like, oh no. It's one thing to talk about in a church about alcohol or drugs. It's quite another thing to talk about pornography. It really is. The society just has this really tortured relationship with pornography. It's everywhere. We condone it, yet we never talk about it, really, and the effect that it has on people.
Yeah, super taboo in many, many, many churches.
Yeah. And my pastor's asking me to share that.
Right.
And I really had to think about that. I said, and a guy knew that he had started a life recovery ministry at our previous church. He said, there is a lot of churches, they have this thing he called the spirit of, shh, we don't talk about that stuff. Right. And that spirit of shh is deadly. Relationships get destroyed. Marriages get destroyed. Relationships between parents and children get destroyed because of the spirit of, shh, we don't talk about this stuff. I was like, okay, Chris, if you really believe this stuff and you think that the church needs to be the first place where people go, well, it's time to get up there and rip the stinking Band-Aid off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just to show it for what it is. And so I said, okay. And I go up there and I had one prop with me, and that was a computer mouse. I said, this may look like, what is this? And people say, oh, it's a computer mouse. I said, yeah, you'd be right. I said, there's another thing too. This thing was like a noose around my neck. And I started to air it out about this whole recovery journey, discovering pornography and masturbation and what it done in my life, and then what recovery started to look like and that type of stuff. And I was terrified the whole time. And when I was done, the congregation gave me a standing ovation, just like they gave my wife. And I was blown away.
Yeah, it's a huge blessing.
Yes, it was. I had people for months coming up to me afterwards and saying, thank you for sharing. I couldn't imagine that my story in a setting like that could be so helpful. And oh, by the way, we have 2 services every Sunday. After going through it the first time, I had to do it again, right? And I got, a similar reaction from people. That's what the church needs to look like, is to be honest with ourselves and say, everybody in the congregation sitting out there in those seats, they got a story and they got struggles. It may not be addiction. It may be pride. It may be violence. It may be greed. It may just be emotional manipulation, abuse. It could be a whole bunch of things, right? It could be flat out trauma. I think that's a huge issue within the church. There are so many people who've been severely wounded emotionally and spiritually without a whole lot of help. And churches need to talk about this type of stuff so that not only talk about it, but then be a friendly place for people to talk about and to get and seek help. So that's what drives this ministry that we have. We got people that struggle with drugs, alcohol, food lust, sex, gambling, work, internet addiction, and or are have family members who struggle with food, drugs, lust, sex, work, gambling, addiction, internet, what have you, right? So in many cases, got check marks on several items in the list.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I wish I could take a picture of everyone that comes walking in the door, and if they stick with it, show it to them a year later.
Oh, yeah. Big difference.
There is a huge difference. And that's one of the things that really lights me up, with recovery ministry, is just how, my heart gets full when I see people having victory over the same type of stuff that was ripping me up, ripping my wife up, ripping her daughter up, affecting my son, big time. To see how God shines his light and pours out his love and his grace on people, if they're obedient to his call and to his will, that truly amazing things happen. And to have the honor of being a part of that, some small part of people achieving that victory, stacking those victories in their lives one after the other, and to see multiple stacks, sort of like that room where I imagine where that Nigerian prince that wants to give me $1 million, bullion, that room where he's got all those gold bricks set up, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of the picture I have, is what these victories stacking is like, is one after another, and there's whole piles of them around, and that lights me up. Okay. So what it looks like for my wife specifically is she works a very strong AA program. She works a very strong OA program. Who knew that food could be an addictive issue? Okay. For her, it was. Okay. And so she's, she's been working a very strong OA program, which, by the way, I started as well
Okay.
because it was like a year and a half ago. I went to a doctor because I was having UTIs and I was having, just feeling really sluggish and I was really thirsty and that type of stuff. And they did a urine analysis and they said, the sugar in your urine is extremely high. So I got an A1C uh, blood test done. I came back and I clocked in with one of the highest numbers of anyone I've ever heard with an A1C reading. It was like 12.6.
Whew.
It's like, it's supposed to be what, 6.7 or lower or something like that. And I had never heard a number that high. I was like, holy crap. Well, I come from a long line of diabetics in my family.
All right.
And food addiction was kind of a thing in some of the generations, And so I started applying those principles in that part of my life that I had an unhealthy relationship with food. Okay. And within 3 months, I lost like about 25 pounds and my A1C landed like around 7.0. And I didn't have to take any metformin or any other drugs. They wanted to put me on statin meds because they tried to scare me with, oh, well, you got this heart attack risk now. You're in your 60s and you got diabetes and your cholesterol was like, not all that good. Triglycerides were out of balance. So you got to get on this stuff. I said, well, give me 3 months. Thankfully, I had a general practitioner who was like, okay, let's give her 3 months, see what you do. She was blown away, right? She said, how'd you do that? I said, I'm already in recovery for several things. I just started doing that with regards to food. I applied that in those principles in that part of my life, right? So my wife works and I thank my wife because she was the one that introduced me to this and supported me through the whole thing, right? And taught me a lot. Thanks, babe. You saved my life, literally. I know what happens to diabetics that are untreated, and it is not a pleasant thing. When someone has, chronic untreated diabetes, it is deadly. I did not want that for me. So she works strong program. My wife has always had kind of like an entrepreneurial bent. She always wanted to be independent operator, and so she originally got certified to be a health coach and try to do that. And then she ended up getting introduced to family recovery life coaching. She got certified in that, and that's what she does now professionally.
Oh, nice.
She works with families that have gone through this struggles similar to what we had gone through. We didn't have that type of help, people that could help us navigate the system, how to have a healthier conversation with our loved ones, right? We didn't know how to do that. There was a lot of stuff we kind of had to figure out on our own. And she got certified in how to lead other families and to be able to have healthy conversations, to do a mini intervention and to how to establish boundaries in their lives, for their own protection, and how to be loving towards their loved ones even when they're in the midst of their stuff. Okay. So that's what she does professionally. She's helped a lot of families, and, and I'm kind of like her back office. I got trained how to do it as well, but, I got my regular job. So I do that kind of part-time, but, I'm kind of like her sounding board and do her accounting and taxes and all that other stuff and support the business that way. And so that's kind of how it's played out, and, I'm kind of an old guy now. And eventually, it's get to a point where I won't be able to keep up with my corporate job. And so just looking at what's the next thing. It'll probably be some sort of recovery related thing, and not quite sure what that looks like yet. And like that insight I had in the early going, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I cannot wait to see it because I know it's going to be a good thing.
Yes, it
I
has.
just don't know what it looks like
It has been and will be.
yet. Yes.
Continue to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's awesome, man. I'm stoked, for you and your family, and
Thank you.
I'm glad that they were able to give their permission to you to be able to speak about that and about their stories in addition to yours, and going to bring that whole aspect of family recovery, family healing together.
Yeah.
There's a big piece of that is needed out there for people to hear. I mean, the individual story is important, yet, like you said, show me an addict and I'll show you the family that's been affected.
Yeah.
In addition to that, so yeah, I mean, I'm super happy that you came and
Yeah,
chose to
same
sit
here.
here and put your story out there, and really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Is
You
there,
know, this is the first time I've ever actually had an opportunity to tell the whole story, or at least as
really
much as I can fit into. Um, how long has it been? Oh,
3-4 hours?
good grief. Man, do I know how to talk, right?
That's good stuff,
I
man.
don't know how to shut up.
It's all
That's
worth
my
it.
problem. So, but yeah, thank you. This has actually been healing for me. To remind me once again. I got this built-in forgetter, right?
Me too.
I tend to forget things, and even worse is I forget that I have a built-in forgetter.
Right.
So this reminded me that there's some stuff that I've forgotten, and the times when I get to tell my story, or my wife and I get to tell our story together with people, I get to relive and get to see that broad sweep of where I was with all this pain and mayhem and confusion and shame and anger and all that sort of stuff, and how over time God stepped in and it has turned into something peaceful and beautiful and worthwhile, and a service to other people, from a healthy place, not out of compulsion, which was my codependent nature, but because people deserve it. And if I want to love other people, then it's not just I say, oh, well, be fed and be warmed and then walk away or something like that. It's like, love puts on shoes, puts on gloves, right? Sometimes has to put on the face mask, the blast shield, as it were, because sometimes it's gritty work.
Yep.
Plain and simple. There are times I've had conversations with people, or my wife has conversations, and then when they walk away, I feel like gotta kind of wipe it off, right? Because that's how toxic they are, or their situations are at that particular time. It's not a judgment on them,
Right.
It's just like, man, they're going through a lot, and some of this stuff is really slimy. So, gotta kind of wipe it off so that I don't take it in for myself, and just ask God for guidance as to how can I love this person in this moment? What is it that you want me to do? And then, God grant me the knowledge of your will for my life and the power to carry it out. Step 11, right?
That's right.
So that's all I got. Thanks for letting me share, man.
I appreciate it. Well, thanks for joining us on Stacking Victories, and Christ is King.
Christ is King. Amen.